Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.
Operation Hooper. The year was 1988, and the air over southern Angola was heavy with tension. The quiet murmur of the Quito River carried whispers of war, its waters reflecting the strained faces of soldiers from distant lands. In the heart of this remote battlefield, a defining chapter of the Cold War played out, not in Europe or Asia, but in the red dust plains of Angola. Operation Hooper, an audacious South African military campaign, sought to turn the tide of the Battle of Quito, a battle that had drawn the attention of the world. Beneath the Angolan sun, two ideologies collided. On one side stood the South African Defense Force, SADF, and UNITA, their mechanized battalions poised to strike. On the other, the Angolan MPLA, supported by Cuban forces, prepared to defend the town of Quito at all costs. It was a clash not just of armies but of global powers, with the Soviet Union and the United States lurking in the shadows. The South African convoy moved cautiously through the bush, their armored vehicles kicking up clouds of red dust. Colonel Dion Ferreira, a seasoned leader of the SADF, peered through his binoculars. The terrain ahead was unforgiving, a patchwork of open savanna and dense underbrush that offered little cover. Behind him, his troops waited silently, their faces set with grim determination. Across the battlefield, General Leopoldo Sintra Frias of the Cuban forces surveyed his defensive lines. Quito was a lifeline, the last stronghold before the heartland of Angola. He knew the South Africans would throw everything they had to breach it. His soldiers, a mix of Cuban volunteers and Angolan fighters, dug in, fortifying their positions with Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first salvo of artillery shattered the quiet. The South Africans launched a probing attack, testing the defenses. For hours, the two sides exchanged fire, the roar of cannons echoing across the plains. Neither side gave an inch, the opening moves of a deadly chess game. By dawn, the South African forces had regrouped. Operation Hooper's goal was clear: destroy the MPLA and Cuban forces encircling Quito and ensure UNITA's dominance in southern Angola. Colonel Ferreira issued his orders with precision, his voice steady despite the weight of the mission. In the distance, the Cuban forces braced for the next assault. Lieutenant Ricardo Alvarez, a young Cuban tank commander, tightened his grip on the controls of his T-55 tank. The night had been brutal, but he and his crew held their position. He thought of his family back in Havana and the letters he hadn't yet written. The South African attack came with a ferocity that caught even seasoned soldiers off guard. Mirage jets screamed overhead, strafing enemy positions. Behind them, elephant tanks rumbled forward, their heavy guns blasting through the Angolan defenses. The defenders fought back fiercely, their Soviet-made rockets lighting up the battlefield. For Private Johannes Joey van Rensburg, a conscript in the SADF, the war was a world away from his quiet farm in the Free State. The thunder of battle drowned out his thoughts as he followed his unit into the fray. Around him, comrades fell, their cries lost in the cacophony. He clung to his rifle, a lifeline in the chaos. On the other side, Maria, an Angolan nurse, worked tirelessly in a makeshift hospital. Her hands trembled as she stitched wounds and administered morphine. Each soldier she treated reminded her of her brother, missing since the conflict began. She prayed for an end to the violence but knew it was a distant dream. The next phase of Operation Hooper targeted the Tumpo Triangle, a critical area where the Angolan and Cuban forces had fortified their positions. South African engineers worked under constant fire to clear minefields, their progress slow and perilous. Major Pablo Hernandez, a Cuban officer, coordinated the defense with unwavering resolve. His men held their ground despite relentless airstrikes and artillery barrages. He admired their bravery but feared they wouldn't hold out much longer. The South African assault was unrelenting. Infantry and tanks advanced in unison, their movements choreographed to perfection. Yet, for every gain, they paid a heavy price. The Tumpo Triangle became a symbol of resistance, a place where blood and determination clashed under the unforgiving Angolan sun. The battlefield at Tumpo Triangle was shrouded in smoke and dust. The relentless exchange of artillery fire turned the area into a chaotic wasteland. South African engineers struggled to clear paths through the minefields, each step fraught with danger. The sharp crack of an exploding mine reminded everyone of the ever-present peril. Corporal Willem Pretorius, a seasoned sapper, led his team with steady nerves. His job was to detect and defuse mines, knowing one wrong move could mean disaster. His comrades admired his calm demeanor, but inside, Willem carried the weight of every decision. Every step forward was a gamble, but the mission demanded progress. In the Cuban command bunker, General Sintra Frias monitored the situation. Reports from the front lines painted a grim picture. His forces were stretched thin, their supplies dwindling. Yet, they held their ground, their resolve fueled by the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The town of Cuidaquanavale lay just beyond the triangle, its survival tied to their success. As the day wore on, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. Both sides braced for another night of relentless combat, their fates intertwined in the brutal logic of war. The South African High Command met under the cover of darkness. Colonel Ferreira laid out the next phase of Operation Hooper. His voice carried authority, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. The goal was clear: breach the Tumpo defenses and encircle the enemy forces. Time was not on their side. Meanwhile, in the Cuban camp, Major Hernandez devised countermeasures. His experience in guerrilla warfare proved invaluable. He instructed his men to adapt, using hit-and-run tactics to disrupt the South African advance. He knew their strength lay in their resilience and their ability to exploit the terrain. As the strategies unfolded, the soldiers on the ground bore the brunt of these decisions. For Private Joey van Rensburg, orders meant more time in the trenches, where danger lurked in every shadow. Across the lines, Lieutenant Ricardo Alvarez received his own briefing. His tank crew was to reinforce a weak point in the defenses, a mission that felt like a death sentence. The battle wasn't just about tactics or territory, it was a test of will. Both sides prepared for the next confrontation, knowing the cost of failure could be catastrophic. At dawn, the South Africans launched a massive assault on the Quanavale defensive line. Waves of infantry advanced under the cover of artillery and airstrikes. Mirage jets screamed overhead, their bombs carving paths through enemy positions. In the Cuban trenches, the soldiers braced for impact. The ground shook with each explosion, but they held firm. Major Hernandez rallied his men, his voice cutting through the chaos. Stand your ground. For Cuba and Angola. The South African Elephant tanks pressed forward, their guns blazing. Behind them, the infantry followed, engaging in close combat with the defenders. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. In the midst of the battle, Maria, the Angolan nurse, worked tirelessly in a field hospital. The wounded poured in, their cries of pain a grim reminder of the human cost. She pushed aside her own fears, focusing on saving lives. Her hands moved with practiced precision, even as the sounds of battle drew closer. As the days turned into weeks, the battle reached a critical juncture. The South Africans made significant gains, pushing the defenders to the brink. Yet, the Cuban and Angolan forces refused to break. Their determination was unyielding, their courage an unspoken pact. Colonel Ferreira received intelligence that the Cuban forces were preparing a counterattack. He knew the stakes were high. If they failed to neutralize the threat, the operation could collapse. He ordered a preemptive strike, hoping to catch the enemy off guard. The Cuban counterattack came with ferocity. Soviets applied rockets and artillery rained down on the South African positions, forcing them to retreat temporarily. Lieutenant Ricardo Alvarez led his tank squadron in a daring maneuver, cutting off a South African supply line. Despite the setbacks, the South Africans regrouped. For Joey, the battle felt endless. He found solace in letters from home, though each one reminded him of the life he might never return to. The war was far from over, and both sides knew the coming days would determine their fates. The Cuban High Command devised a bold strategy to counter the South African advance. General Sintra Frias ordered his forces to lure the South Africans deeper into the Tumpo Triangle, into a trap laden with mines and artillery. The plan relied on precision and coordination, but it was fraught with risk. Lieutenant Ricardo Alvarez received orders to hold the line while the ambush was set. His tank crew worked tirelessly, fortifying their position and camouflaging their vehicles. Ricardo knew they were buying time for a larger move, and he braced himself for the inevitable clash. On the South African side, Colonel Ferreira sensed the enemy's shift in tactics. His instincts warned of a trap, but the operation's momentum demanded they press forward. He ordered reconnaissance units to probe the defenses, their reports feeding his growing unease. As night fell, the battlefield fell silent. Both sides prepared for the storm that would inevitably break. In the eerie calm, soldiers whispered prayers, wrote letters, or stared at the stars, seeking solace in the vastness above. At dawn, the South Africans launched another assault, their armored columns advancing into the Tumpo Triangle. The first few kilometers were eerily quiet, the defenders seemingly absent. Colonel Ferreira's radio crackled with reports of clear terrain ahead. The calm unnerved him. Then, the trap was sprung. Cuban artillery opened fire, their shells landing with devastating accuracy. The ground erupted, throwing vehicles and men into the air. South African tanks found themselves bogged down in a maze of mines, their progress halted. Corporal Willem Pretorius worked feverishly to clear a path through the minefield. His team's lives depended on his skill, and every step forward felt like a gamble. The sound of approaching enemy fire grew louder, adding to the urgency. Ricardo Alvarez's tank crew joined the fray, their T-55s engaging the South African elephants. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the battlefield, a brutal symphony of war. Ricardo's hands were steady on the controls, his focus unwavering as he directed his crew. The South African forces fought valiantly, their discipline and training evident in every maneuver. Colonel Ferreira's voice crackled over the radio, issuing orders and rallying his men. Despite the chaos, his leadership kept the operation from collapsing entirely. Private Joey van Rensburg found himself in the thick of the battle. His unit was pinned down, taking heavy fire from Cuban machine gun nests. Joey's heart pounded as he returned fire, the weight of his rifle a comforting anchor in the storm. On the Cuban side, Major Pablo Hernandez coordinated the counterattack with precision. His men pressed their advantage, pushing the South Africans back. Yet, every gain came at a cost. He watched as comrades fell, their sacrifices etched into his memory. Maria, the Angolan nurse, worked tirelessly in the field hospital. Her hands were bloody, her face streaked with sweat and tears. She moved from patient to patient, offering words of comfort and hope. Her resolve was unshakable, even as the wounded piled up around her. As the day wore on, the battlefield became a scene of unimaginable devastation. The South Africans regrouped, launching a desperate counteroffensive. Mirage jets streaked across the sky, their bombs carving through enemy lines. Behind them, elephant tanks advanced, their guns blazing. The Cuban and Angolan forces held firm, their resolve unbroken. General Sintra Frias ordered reinforcements to the front, his voice carrying a steely determination. He knew the battle for Cuidaquanavale was not just about territory, it was a stand against apartheid and imperialism. For Joey, the battle blurred into a cacophony of noise and chaos. He fought alongside his comrades, their bond forged in the crucible of war. Across the lines, Ricardo Alvarez pushed his tank to its limits, his crew's bravery a testament to their shared purpose. As night fell, the battlefield fell silent once more. Both sides licked their wounds, knowing the fight was far from over. In the quiet, the soldiers reflected on the day's events, their thoughts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The following days brought a tense pause in the battle. Both sides used the time to regroup, resupply, and tend to their wounded. The Tumpo Triangle remained a no-man's land, littered with wreckage and the scars of relentless combat. Colonel Ferreira reviewed the latest intelligence with his officers. The South African forces had inflicted significant damage, but the enemy's defenses remained formidable. He knew their success hinged on breaking the stalemate and maintaining momentum. In the Cuban camp, Major Hernandez convened his commanders. The trap at Tumpo had succeeded in halting the South African advance, but it came at a heavy cost. Supplies were running low, and morale was stretched thin. Still, Hernandez emphasized the importance of holding the line. "This battle is more than a military engagement," he said. "It is a symbol of our resistance." For the soldiers, the pause was bittersweet. Joey van Rensburg cleaned his rifle and shared a rare moment of laughter with his comrades, their camaraderie a fragile reprieve from the horrors of war. On the Cuban side, Ricardo Alvarez took stock of his tank crew's resolve, their determination evident despite their exhaustion. The South African forces launched another offensive, this time targeting a weak point in the Cuban defenses. The plan was audacious, involving a coordinated assault with air support and mechanized infantry. Colonel Ferreira knew it was a gamble, but the stakes demanded bold action. The attack began at dawn, with Mirage jets screaming overhead, their bombs lighting up the Cuban positions. On the ground, elephant tanks and infantry advanced in a pincer formation, their movements precise and calculated. The Cuban defenders responded with fierce resistance. Ricardo Alvarez's tank was among the first to engage the South Africans. His crew worked seamlessly, their T-55 holding its ground against the larger elephants. "Hold steady," Ricardo shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. The fighting was intense, with neither side willing to yield. In the thick of the battle, Joey found himself separated from his unit. He took cover behind a burning vehicle, his rifle trained on the advancing enemy. Each shot he fired felt like an eternity, the battle's noise a deafening backdrop. By midday, the South Africans had made significant gains, but their advance came at a heavy cost. Colonel Ferreira monitored the battlefield from his command post, his face etched with worry. Reports of mounting casualties weighed on him, but he knew they were close to a breakthrough. Major Hernandez rallied his men, moving between positions to bolster their resolve. "We cannot let them take this ground," he urged. His presence inspired his troops, even as the situation grew dire. In the field hospital, Maria worked tirelessly to save lives. She moved with urgency, her hands steady despite the chaos. Each soldier she treated was a reminder of the human toll of the conflict. Among them was a young Cuban soldier, barely older than a boy, who clung to her hand as he whispered a prayer. The battle reached a fever pitch as the sun began to set. The South African forces were on the brink of breaking through, but the Cuban and Angolan defenders held firm, their determination a bulwark against the tide. As night fell, the South African forces secured a portion of the Tumpo Triangle, but their victory was far from decisive. The cost in lives and resources was staggering, and the Cuban forces remained entrenched in key positions. Colonel Ferreira stood in the aftermath, surveying the battlefield. The wreckage of tanks and vehicles lay scattered, a testament to the ferocity of the fight. He knew the operation was far from over and that the hardest battles lay ahead. On the Cuban side, Major Hernandez regrouped his forces. They had suffered heavy losses, but their spirit remained unbroken. "We've held them back," he told his men, his voice firm. "And we will continue to do so." Joey and his comrades huddled together that night, their exhaustion palpable. Across the lines, Ricardo Alvarez shared a quiet moment with his crew, their bond forged in the crucible of war. Both sides knew that the battle for Cuidaquanavale was not just about territory, it was a fight for survival and legacy. The story of Operation Phoenix. The sun rose reluctantly over the farmlands of northern Southwest Africa in February 1983. The silence of the sprawling savannas was deceptive, masking the tensions that had gripped the region for years. This land, seemingly untouched by time, now found itself a theater for one of the bloodiest chapters of the South African border war. Whispered warnings of incursions by planned fighters spread among the farmers and soldiers alike, setting the stage for a confrontation that would forever change the lives of those who called this land home. In the early hours of February 15, planned fighters crossed the Angolan border under the cover of darkness. They moved swiftly, their familiarity with the terrain their greatest ally. Farmers in the area began noticing unsettling signs, livestock missing, fields trampled, and fleeting shadows in the distance. For the farmers, these were not mere coincidences but harbingers of an imminent threat. At the nearby SADF base, Captain Johan van Rensburg scanned the reports piling on his desk. A veteran of several border skirmishes, Johan knew the delicate balance of life along this volatile frontier. He understood that the planned fighters weren't just seeking to disrupt, they aimed to inspire fear and destabilize. With the enemy moving deeper into civilian areas, the clock was ticking for the SADF to respond decisively. Elsewhere, in a modest homestead outside Grootfontein, Elsa Marais clutched her young daughter close as she listened to her husband Willem load his rifle. They had heard the stories, neighbors who had vanished without a trace and farms that had been burned to the ground. Elsa whispered a silent prayer, knowing the days ahead would test their resilience. The SADF mobilized quickly. Columns of military trucks kicked up clouds of dust as they roared down dirt roads, carrying soldiers to the front. The operation was named Phoenix, a symbol of rebirth and resilience. For those involved, however, it was a fight for survival against an enemy as elusive as the desert wind. As Operation Phoenix unfolded, the soldiers discovered that this was no ordinary campaign. The planned fighters employed guerrilla tactics, ambushing convoys and melting back into the landscape before the dust could settle. Johan, leading a reconnaissance team, was struck by the stark beauty of the savannah, a cruel contrast to the violence it now concealed. "Stay alert," Johan whispered to his unit as they traversed a dry riverbed. His words hung heavy in the still air. Every bush, every rock seemed a potential hiding spot for the enemy. Johann's team included young recruits, some barely out of school, their wide eyes betraying their fear and inexperience. Meanwhile, in Windhoek, political leaders grappled with the broader implications of the incursion. For Prime Minister P.W. Botha, the operation was more than a military response, it was a chance to assert control over a region slipping through South Africa's grasp. Orders were clear: neutralize the threat at all costs, regardless of collateral damage. As the weeks stretched into months, the conflict seeped into every corner of life. Farmers like Willem Murray began coordinating with military patrols, sharing intelligence and offering their land as temporary bases. Elsa's days were consumed by worry, each night bringing dreams of Willem not returning from his watch. Yet amid the chaos, a strange camaraderie emerged, a bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The SADF forces fanned out across the northern farmlands, determined to intercept the planned fighters. With every passing day, the tension mounted. Soldiers patrolled the rugged terrain, their senses sharpened by the constant threat of ambush. Captain Johan van Rensburg's team often led the way, navigating the labyrinth of dry riverbeds and dense thorn bushes where the fighters were known to hide. One morning, Johan's unit came across an abandoned village. The silence was unnerving. Rusty cooking pots sat cold on the ground, and the skeletal remains of a once thriving settlement lay in disarray. Johan instructed his men to search the area, their boots crunching softly on the cracked earth. They found signs of a hasty departure, footprints leading toward the Angolan border. In Grootfontein, Willem Murray and other farmers formed an impromptu militia to protect their homes. They shared information with SADF patrols, pointing out suspicious activity in old trails used by the planned fighters. Willem's nights were sleepless as he took turns guarding his land, his rifle always within arm's reach. Elsa, though fearful, ensured the family carried on as best they could, finding solace in routines that masked the ever-present danger. In Windhoek, strategists debated their next moves. They knew the planned fighters were well supplied and motivated, making them a formidable adversary. Intelligence reports suggested the fighters had local sympathizers who provided food, shelter, and information. The SADF's challenge was not only to defeat the enemy but also to win the hearts and minds of the people, a task that seemed increasingly impossible as the conflict escalated. On a warm March afternoon, Johan's unit encountered their first major skirmish. As they patrolled a narrow path flanked by tall grass, the air suddenly erupted with gunfire. The planned fighters had set a perfect ambush, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Johan shouted orders over the deafening cacophony, his voice a lifeline for his panicked soldiers. "Find cover. Return fire," he yelled, his eyes scanning for the source of the attack. The young recruits scrambled behind trees and rocks, their hands trembling as they clutched their rifles. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with bullets zipping through the air like angry wasps. Hours later, as the gunfire subsided, Johan surveyed the scene. Smoke rose from the charred grass, and the acrid smell of gunpowder lingered. The enemy had melted back into the wilderness, leaving behind the haunting silence of the aftermath. Several soldiers were wounded, their moans of pain a stark reminder of the cost of war. That night, around the campfire, Johan spoke to his men. He didn't sugarcoat the reality of their situation but reminded them of their mission. "We're here to protect these lands and the people who call them home," he said. His words carried a weight that resonated with his soldiers, many of whom wrote letters to their families before drifting into an uneasy sleep. At the Murray farm, Elsa faced her own battles. The days were long and fraught with uncertainty. Yet, she refused to let fear dictate her life. She organized the neighboring women to prepare emergency supplies for the SADF, sewing uniforms and cooking meals to support the soldiers. One afternoon, as Elsa stood in her kitchen, she noticed a young boy lingering near the farm gate. He was no older than 10, his clothes tattered, and his eyes filled with worry. She approached him cautiously, offering him water and food. Through halting words, the boy revealed that his village had been destroyed, his family scattered. Elsa decided to shelter him, even as she feared the boy might bring trouble to their doorstep. Willem returned that evening to find Elsa sitting with the boy, a look of determination on her face. "He has nowhere to go," she said simply. Willem nodded, understanding that their humanity couldn't be abandoned, even in the face of war. The boy became a quiet presence in their home, a symbol of the innocents caught in the crossfire. The days turned into weeks, and the SADF forces pushed deeper into the wilderness. Johan van Rensburg's unit was tasked with tracking planned fighters who had slipped through their patrol lines. The pursuit was grueling, the unforgiving landscape wearing down even the most seasoned soldiers. The heat of the Namibian sun bore down on them, and their boots churned up red dust with every step. One afternoon, they reached a dry riverbed littered with the remnants of a recent skirmish, discarded shell casings, broken weapons, and hastily abandoned supplies. Johan crouched beside a charred log, examining footprints that led toward the dense bush. "They're close," he murmured, signaling his men to proceed with caution. The soldiers moved in tight formation, the silence only broken by the rustle of leaves and the distant cries of birds. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and chaos erupted. Clan fighters had doubled back, setting another ambush. The firefight was intense, with the crackle of gunfire echoing through the trees. Johan's training kicked in as he coordinated his men, their movements precise despite the chaos. When the dust settled, the planned fighters had vanished once again, leaving behind only questions. Johan knew they were fighting a shadowy enemy, one that thrived on the uncertainty of guerrilla warfare. Yet, he also felt the resolve of his men harden. This was their land, and they would defend it at all costs. Meanwhile, Elsa Marais and her neighbors found themselves caring for an increasing number of displaced people. The war had uprooted entire communities, and the roads to Grootfontein were lined with families carrying their few belongings. Elsa's farm became an unofficial refuge, a place where the weary could rest before moving on. Among the refugees was an elderly woman named Maria, whose weathered face told a story of hardship. She had lost her son to the conflict, and her voice trembled as she spoke of her hope for peace. Elsa listened quietly, her heart heavy with the weight of Maria's words. Though they came from different worlds, they were united in their longing for the war to end. Willem Marais worked tirelessly to reinforce the farm's defenses, but he could see the strain on Elsa. "You can't save everyone," he said one evening, his voice gentle but firm. Elsa nodded, though she knew she couldn't turn anyone away. For her, the war was not just about survival, it was about preserving the humanity that the violence threatened to destroy. In the evenings, Elsa would gather the refugees around a fire, sharing stories and songs that reminded them of better times. The sound of laughter, though faint, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As Operation Phoenix entered its second month, the SADF shifted its strategy. Intelligence reports indicated that planned fighters were using a network of hidden bases to stage their incursions. Johan's unit was assigned to locate and destroy these strongholds, a task that required both courage and cunning. In the early hours of the morning, Johan and his men approached one such base hidden deep in a rocky valley. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots on gravel. They moved carefully, their weapons at the ready. As they neared the entrance, a flare shot into the sky, illuminating the valley in an eerie glow. The firefight that followed was fierce. Planned fighters defended their position with determination, their resistance a stark reminder of their commitment to their cause. Johann's men fought valiantly, their training and teamwork shining through in the chaos. When the battle ended, the base lay in ruins, its defenders scattered. But victory came at a cost. Several soldiers were injured, and Johann felt the weight of every decision he made. He knew the war was far from over, but each battle brought them closer to securing the region. Back at the Murray farm, life carried on despite the challenges. Elsa and Willem grew closer, their shared struggle strengthening their bond. The boy they had taken in, now known as Peter, became a part of their family. He helped with the chores and brought laughter to their days, his presence a reminder that hope could endure even in the darkest times. One evening, as the sun set over the savannah, Willem sat with Peter on the porch. "You'll grow up to be strong," Willem said, ruffling the boy's hair. Peter smiled, his eyes bright with determination. For the Murray family, Peter represented a future worth fighting for, a future where peace might finally take root. Elsewhere, Johann's unit regrouped, their camaraderie deepening with each mission. They shared stories around the campfire, their laughter a brief reprieve from the horrors of war. Johann found solace in these moments, knowing that the bonds they forged would carry them through whatever lay ahead. As April approached, the SADF intensified its efforts to neutralize planned activity in the region. Johann van Rensburg's unit was deployed to the rugged hills near the Angolan border, where intelligence suggested a major planned stronghold was located. The terrain was treacherous, the air thin and dry, but the soldiers pressed on, driven by their mission. Johann studied the map spread out on the hood of his jeep, his brow furrowed in concentration. The stronghold was nestled in a series of caves, making it a natural fortress. He turned to his men, his voice calm but firm. "This will be our toughest mission yet. Stay sharp, and trust each other." The ascent was grueling. The soldiers moved cautiously, their senses heightened by the possibility of an ambush. As they neared the caves, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the hills. Johann signaled for his team to take cover, their movements silent and deliberate. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. Planned fighters poured out of the caves, their rifles blazing. Johann's unit fought back with precision, their training and discipline evident in every move. The battle raged for hours, the rocky terrain amplifying the chaos. When it was over, the stronghold was secured, but the cost was high. Several soldiers lay injured, their comrades rallying to carry them to safety. At the Murray farm, Elsa's role as a caregiver expanded. Refugees continued to arrive, seeking shelter from the violence that consumed their land. Elsa worked tirelessly, coordinating with the local community to provide food and medical supplies. Her farmhouse, once a place of quiet solitude, now buzzed with activity. One evening, a young woman named Lena arrived at the farm, her eyes hollow with grief. She had lost her husband in a skirmish and carried her infant daughter on her back. Elsa welcomed her with open arms, offering a warm meal and a place to rest. Over time, Lena found solace in the safety of the farm, her strength returning as she helped Elsa care for others. Despite the hardships, moments of joy emerged. The children played in the fields, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim reality of the war. Elsa watched them from the porch, her heart heavy but hopeful. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to provide a sanctuary for those who needed it. The success of the SADS operations came at a steep price. Casualties mounted, and the soldiers bore the physical and emotional scars of battle. Johann often found himself staring into the fire at night, his thoughts consumed by the faces of those they had lost. He wrote letters to the families of his fallen comrades, each word a painful reminder of the sacrifices made. Back in Windhoek, the political leadership declared Operation Phoenix a strategic success. Yet, for those on the front lines, the victories felt hollow. The planned fighters, though battered, remained a formidable force. The soldiers knew the war was far from over, and each mission brought new challenges. Amid the struggle, moments of humanity shone through. Johann's unit encountered a group of civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. The soldiers provided food and medical aid, their actions a reminder that even in war, compassion could prevail. For Johann, these moments reaffirmed his belief in their cause, even as the weight of the conflict bore down on him. As the operation drew to a close, the landscape began to shift. The planned fighters retreated deeper into Angola, their incursions into southwest Africa temporarily halted. The farmers returned to their fields, rebuilding their lives piece by piece. At the Murray farm, Willem and Elsa stood together on the porch, watching the sunrise. The land, scarred by months of conflict, still held its beauty. Peter played with the other children in the yard, his laughter filling the air. For Willem and Elsa, the end of the operation marked a new beginning, a chance to heal and rebuild. Johann van Rensburg returned to base, his unit battered but unbroken. He carried the memories of the war with him, a mosaic of pain, resilience, and hope. As he prepared for his next assignment, he resolved to honor the sacrifices of those who had fought beside him. Though Operation Phoenix was over, the echoes of its battles lingered. The land, the people, and the soldiers who had fought would carry its legacy, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The story of Operation BISON. The year was 1968, and a scorching Sahel sun bore witness to a nation divided. Chad, a landlocked former French colony, had been independent for less than a decade but was already mired in chaos. The Chadian civil war raged, its flames fanned by the emergence of the Fralanat insurgents, a movement born of discontent and a thirst for revolution. With over 3,000 fighters, they threatened to unravel the fragile fabric of a young republic. President François Tombalbaye, his government cornered and desperate, called for help from an old ally, France. By April 1969, Operation BISON began. France dispatched 3,000 elite soldiers to Chad, not merely to quell a rebellion but to preserve its waning influence in Africa. This story unfolds not through the eyes of one hero but through the myriad lives embroiled in this operation, a French general balancing duty and ethics, a Chadian rebel dreaming of liberation, and a villager caught between two forces. Together, their narratives weave the tapestry of a complex and turbulent chapter in history. The muffled sound of boots on parched earth echoed in the outskirts of N'Djamena, then called Fort Lamy. French General Michel Arnaud surveyed the horizon from his camp. The desert, vast and indifferent, was a formidable adversary. Operation BISON's mission was clear: dismantle Fralanat's influence and stabilize central Chad. Yet, the moral complexities of this war loomed larger than the dunes themselves. Far from the French camp, a Fralanat cell huddled around a flickering lamp in the Tibesti Mountains. Ibrahim, a fiery young fighter, listened as his commander outlined their next move. The French will come with their helicopters and cannons, the commander warned, but we fight for our land and our dignity. They fight for power. The men murmured their assent, their resolve hardened by years of struggle. In the village of Ngura, Aminata, a widow, clutched her child tightly. The French soldiers had arrived earlier that day, imposing strict curfews and confiscating goods suspected of aiding the rebels. She had heard whispers of atrocities, of lives caught between insurgent retribution and military enforcement. Tonight, she prayed for silence. As the sun set, the French forces began their first operation in the region. Helicopters roared overhead, their searchlights slicing through the dark. Beneath the blaring engines and the soldiers' voices, the desert seemed to hold its breath. For the people of Chad, a long, uncertain night had begun. The morning sun cast long shadows over Fort Lamy as General Michel Arnaud convened a strategy meeting. The room buzzed with tension, the air thick with dust and the weight of impossible decisions. Intelligence reports indicated a Fralinat stronghold in the eastern town of Abesh, but it lay deep in rebel territory. Arnaud's officers debated the risk of an aerial assault versus a ground operation, their voices rising with urgency. "We have the resources to strike swiftly," Colonel Dubois argued, his finger stabbing at the map. "Air support can neutralize their positions before they have a chance to regroup." Arnaud's voice cut through the noise. "And what of the civilians? Are we to leave a trail of devastation in our wake?" "No, gentlemen, we will engage, but with precision. This is not a conquest, it is a restoration." Meanwhile, Ibrahim and his comrades prepared their defenses in Abesh. Armed with outdated rifles and sheer determination, they built makeshift barricades, their spirits bolstered by the belief that they were fighting for a free Chad. "The French may have their helicopters," Ibrahim told his younger brother, Mahmoud, "but they do not have our resolve." As the French convoy departed Fort Lamy under the cover of dusk, Arnaud felt the familiar pang of uncertainty. His orders were clear, but the human cost of this mission gnawed at him. The convoy rolled on, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, silent and watchful. The first shots rang out at dawn. French forces, supported by helicopters armed with 20mm cannons, moved swiftly toward the rebel-held town. Dust clouds rose as the vehicles advanced, the sharp crack of rifle fire punctuating the roar of engines. Above, the choppers circled like hawks, their presence a harbinger of death. In the heart of the town, Ibrahim directed his men from behind a crumbling wall. "Hold your fire until they're close," he instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos. Mahmoud crouched beside him, clutching his weapon tightly, his wide eyes betraying his fear. The French troops encountered fierce resistance. The rebels, though outgunned, fought with desperation. One helicopter took a direct hit from a stray RPG, spiraling out of control before crashing into the desert. For a moment, a cheer rose among the insurgents, only to be drowned out by the retaliatory hail of gunfire. As the battle raged, Aminata watched from her hiding place outside the town. She had fled with her child as soon as the fighting began, her heart heavy with the knowledge that others had not been so lucky. The distant sounds of war were a grim reminder of the fragility of her world. By nightfall, the French forces had seized control of Abesh, but at a cost. Arnaud walked among the casualties, the faces of the dead, rebel and soldier alike, etched into his memory. Victory felt hollow. "This is not peace," he murmured, "only a pause in the storm." In the aftermath of the battle, the French established a temporary base in Abesh. Supplies were flown in, and the wounded were treated. Yet, even as they fortified their position, whispers of discontent reached Arnaud's ears. Tombouctou, the Chadian president, was meddling once again. A courier arrived with an urgent message from the capital. Tombouctou demanded that Arnaud take drastic measures against the Arab population of Ngura, whom the president accused of supporting the rebels. The general stared at the missive, his jaw tightening. This was not a war he had signed up to fight. At a meeting with his officers, Arnaud announced his decision. "I will not carry out genocide," he declared, his voice firm. We are here to restore order, not to destroy a people. The room fell silent, the weight of his defiance sinking in. He knew the consequences of defying Tombalbaye, but his conscience left him no choice. Far away, Ibrahim regrouped with the surviving rebels in the Tibesti Mountains. The loss at Abesh was a blow, but it had not broken their spirit. We will rise again, he vowed to his comrades. The French will leave one day, and when they do, Chad will be ours. The desert night was quiet, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Arnaud's resolve, Ibrahim's determination, and Tombalbaye's demands would soon collide in a struggle that would shape the future of a nation. Back in Fort Lamy, the air was thick with uncertainty. General Michel Arnaud had made his stand against President Tombalbaye's orders, but the political repercussions were swift. An emissary from the Chadian government arrived at the French headquarters with a stern warning: General Arnaud must remember that his mission exists only because of Chadian hospitality. Arnaud dismissed the messenger with a curt nod, his mind already racing. He had always known that this war was as much about politics as it was about bullets, but now, he faced enemies on two fronts, rebels in the desert and a president in the capital. If we lose our integrity here, he confided to his aide, Captain François Delon, we lose everything. Meanwhile, the streets of Fort Lamy bustled with a mixture of fear and resistance. Local markets were quieter than usual, the shadow of French soldiers a constant reminder of the war. Among the civilians, whispers grew louder. Some admired Arnaud's refusal to obey Tombalbaye's orders, while others feared French meddling in their nation's affairs. In the evening, Arnaud received a telegram from Paris. The French government expressed measured support for his stance but warned him to tread carefully. The telegram's coded language made one thing clear: Arnaud was on his own. As the general sat in his office, staring at maps of rebel-controlled territories, he felt the weight of the coming battles. His decision had drawn a line in the sand, one that might cost him everything. Deep in the Tibesti Mountains, Ibrahim stood before his men. Their ranks were thinner after the loss at Abesh, but their determination remained unbroken. We must show the French that Chad is not theirs to command, he declared. His plan was audacious: an ambush on a French supply convoy heading east. Under the cover of night, the rebels moved into position along a narrow desert road. Hidden behind boulders and dunes, they waited patiently. The convoy, a string of trucks laden with ammunition and food, rumbled into view just before dawn. The rebels struck with precision, their gunfire tearing through the early morning stillness. Caught off guard, the French soldiers scrambled to return fire. A firefight ensued, the harsh crack of rifles and the roar of engines filling the air. Above, a helicopter circled, its searchlight sweeping the battlefield. Despite their superior firepower, the French were pinned down, their vehicles disabled by well-placed grenades. When the dust settled, the rebels had vanished, leaving behind smoldering wreckage and stunned survivors. It was a small victory, but for Ibrahim and his comrades, it was proof that their fight was far from over. The aftermath of the ambush reached Fort Lamy swiftly. General Arnaud was furious. How could we underestimate them? He demanded during a tense briefing. Colonel Dubois, ever pragmatic, suggested increasing aerial reconnaissance, but Arnaud was unconvinced. We need more than helicopters, he said. We need to understand our enemy. Meanwhile, President Tombalbaye seized on the ambush as an opportunity to reassert control. He summoned Arnaud to a meeting, his tone icy. You refused my orders once, he said. Do not mistake that for weakness. You are here to serve Chad, not to question its leaders. Arnaud's response was measured but firm. "Mr. President, my mission is to stabilize this country, not to destroy it. I will not act against my principles." Their exchange left the fragile alliance between France and Chad hanging by a thread. Arnaud returned to his quarters, knowing that Tombobey's patience was wearing thin. "We're fighting two wars," he told Captain Delon. "One in the desert and one in the palace." The sun set over the desert, casting long shadows on the sand. At a small French outpost near the rebel-held Tibesti region, soldiers prepared for another long night. The rebels' ambush had put everyone on edge, and rumors of a larger offensive spread like wildfire. In the nearby village of Calais, Aminata tended to her child. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, fearful of the escalating conflict. French patrols had increased, and the rebels were becoming bolder. For Aminata, survival meant staying invisible, a task that grew harder with each passing day. At the rebel camp, Ibrahim planned his next move. Supplies were running low, and morale was fraying. "We need the people's support," he told his second-in-command. "Without them, we cannot sustain this fight." As the night deepened, the desert seemed to come alive with the echoes of war, distant gunfire, the rumble of trucks, the hum of helicopters. For all sides, the darkness held its secrets and its dangers. The rugged terrain of the Tibesti Mountains loomed like a fortress, its jagged peaks shrouded in mist. For weeks, the French forces had prepared for an assault on a key rebel stronghold nestled deep within this unforgiving landscape. General Arnaud, determined to strike a decisive blow, approved an operation that combined ground troops and aerial support. At dawn, the operation began. Helicopters roared over the mountain passes, their blades slicing through the thin air. On the ground, French infantry advanced cautiously, their boots crunching against the rocky terrain. The rebels, aware of the impending attack, had fortified their position with trenches and makeshift barricades. Ibrahim stood at the center of the rebel defenses, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His men were vastly outnumbered, but the terrain was their ally. "Let the mountains fight with us," he told them, his voice resolute. As the first French units approached, the rebels unleashed a volley of gunfire, triggering an intense battle. The French forces struggled to gain ground. The rocky outcrops provided excellent cover for the insurgents, who moved with agility and precision. Above, helicopter-mounted cannons rained down fire, their deafening blasts shaking the earth. By nightfall, the mountain was lit by the glow of burning vehicles and gunfire. Despite heavy losses, the rebels managed to retreat deeper into the mountains, their spirits bruised but unbroken. For Arnaud, the victory was bittersweet. The operation had cost lives on both sides, and the rebels had escaped once again. "This war is like water through our fingers," he muttered to Colonel Dubois. "We hold it for a moment, but it slips away." The French camp was unusually quiet in the days following the Tibesti assault. Soldiers cleaned their weapons in silence, their eyes betraying the exhaustion of constant combat. Arnaud walked among them, offering words of encouragement, but he knew their spirits were waning. "They need a reason to fight," Captain Delon remarked. "Right now, all they see is sand and blood." Back in Fort Lamy, political tensions reached a boiling point. President Tombobey grew increasingly impatient with the French mission, accusing Arnaud of dragging his feet. "If you cannot finish this war," he wrote in a scathing letter, "I will find someone who can." The letter reached Arnaud on a sweltering afternoon. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each word. It was a veiled threat, one he could not ignore. Yet, as he paced his tent, another thought weighed heavily on his mind. Perhaps Tombobey's government was as much the problem as the rebellion. Meanwhile, in the rebel camp, Ibrahim met with elders from nearby villages. Supplies were dwindling, and the people were growing weary of the war. "Your fight endangers us all," one elder warned. "The French bring destruction wherever they go." "We fight for freedom," Ibrahim countered, his voice steady but tinged with doubt. "But I understand your fears. We will do everything to protect you." Under mounting pressure from Tomboulbay, the French forces launched a series of rapid strikes against suspected rebel hideouts. The operations were brutal and relentless, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Villages were burned, and civilians were caught in the crossfire, fueling resentment against both the French and the Chadian government. Aminata's village was one of the many caught in the chaos. French soldiers stormed through, searching for hidden rebels. Aminata hid with her child in a neighbor's cellar, her heart pounding as the soldiers' voices grew louder. When the sounds of boots faded, she emerged to find her home ransacked and her neighbors missing. In Fort Lamy, Arnaud confronted his officers. "This is not how we win hearts and minds," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "We are alienating the very people we're supposed to protect." But Colonel Dubois, ever pragmatic, disagreed. "General, this is a war. There will be collateral damage. We cannot win by playing it safe." As tensions rose within the French command, Ibrahim and his men prepared for their next offensive. They had received intelligence about a French supply depot near the border. "If we strike there," Ibrahim told his comrades, "we send a message: Chad belongs to its people." In the early hours of the morning, the rebel forces launched a daring raid on the French supply depot in the Canam region. Under the cover of darkness, they infiltrated the perimeter, their movements swift and silent. By the time the first French sentry raised the alarm, it was too late. Explosions rocked the depot as rebels set fire to ammunition stockpiles. Trucks were overturned, and fuel tanks ignited, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. The French soldiers scrambled to respond, but the rebels had already begun their retreat, vanishing into the desert like shadows. The raid was a humiliating blow for the French. Back in Fort Lamy, Arnaud received the news with a grim expression. "They're not just fighting us," he said. "They're making a statement." For Ibrahim, the raid was a rare moment of triumph. As he and his men celebrated in their mountain hideout, he allowed himself a fleeting smile. But deep down, he knew the war was far from over. The French would strike back, and the cycle of violence would continue. The smoke from the raid at Canam still lingered when General Arnaud called his officers into an emergency meeting. The rebel attack was a stark reminder of the insurgents' resilience and the vulnerability of the French mission. "We cannot allow this to go unanswered," Arnaud declared. "The rebels must understand that such audacity comes with consequences." Plans for retaliation were drawn swiftly. French intelligence pinpointed a suspected rebel base near the Enedi Plateau. The operation was to be swift and decisive, combining airstrikes with a ground assault. Helicopters armed with 20mm cannons would lead the charge, followed by infantry sweeping through the area. Under the cover of darkness, French forces moved out. The desert was eerily silent, the soldiers' footsteps muffled by the sand. When the first shots rang out, the night exploded with chaos. The French assault was relentless, the roar of helicopter engines mingling with the sharp crack of gunfire. But the rebels were prepared. They had evacuated most of their fighters from the base, leaving behind traps and diversions to slow the French advance. While the French claimed the base by dawn, it was a hollow victory. The rebels had slipped away once again, leaving Arnaud to confront the frustrating reality of a war fought against shadows. The failure to corner the rebels in Enedi weighed heavily on Arnaud. Sitting alone in his tent, he sifted through reports of casualties and civilian displacement. Every victory seemed to come at a cost, and the general began to question the purpose of their mission. "We are fighting battles," he confided to Captain Delon, "but are we winning the war?" Back in the rebel camp, Ibrahim reviewed the aftermath of the French assault. Though they had avoided a direct confrontation, the attack had cost them valuable supplies. "We need more support from the villages," he told his second-in-command. "Without their help, we cannot continue this fight." But the villages were growing weary of the conflict. In Calais, Aminata listened as her neighbors debated whether to aid the rebels or report them to the French. "They bring us nothing but misery," one elder said. Aminata remained silent, her thoughts consumed by the precarious future of her child. As both sides regrouped, the war's toll became increasingly evident. The desert bore the scars of endless battles, and the people caught in the crossfire grew more desperate by the day. Far from the battlefields, political divisions in Fort Lamy deepened. President Tombalbaye, frustrated by the French mission's slow progress, began to undermine Arnault's authority. Rumors spread that the president was considering seeking support from other nations, a move that could jeopardize France's influence in Chad. Arnault, aware of Tombalbaye's growing hostility, remained focused on his mission. "We cannot allow politics to dictate our strategy," he told his officers. "Our goal is stability, not appeasement." Meanwhile, the French soldiers in the field grappled with low morale. The endless desert, the mounting casualties, and the elusive nature of their enemy took a toll. Letters from home spoke of growing public disapproval of the operation, adding to the soldiers' sense of isolation. In the rebel camp, similar cracks began to show. Some fighters questioned the wisdom of continuing a war that seemed unwinnable. Ibrahim, sensing the unrest, sought to rally his men. "This is not just a fight for today," he told them. "It is a fight for the generations to come." In early 1970, intelligence reports suggested that the rebels were amassing forces near Kufra, a strategic crossroads in northern Chad. General Arnault saw an opportunity to deal a decisive blow and ordered an all-out assault. The French forces, bolstered by reinforcements, prepared for one of the largest operations of the war. The battle began at sunrise, with French artillery pounding the rebel positions. Helicopters swooped in, their cannons blazing as infantry advanced under the cover of fire. The rebels fought fiercely, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. Snipers picked off French soldiers, and hidden mines wreaked havoc on advancing vehicles. Amid the chaos, Ibrahim led a daring counterattack, rallying his men to push back against the French advance. For hours, the battle raged, the desert echoing with the sounds of war. By nightfall, the French had secured Kufra, but at a staggering cost. Dozens of soldiers lay dead, and the rebels had once again retreated into the desert. For Arnault, the victory felt hollow. Standing on the battlefield, surrounded by the wounded and the dead, he realized that the war's true cost was far greater than he had imagined. "We may win battles," he said quietly to Captain Delon, "but this war is breaking us all." As 1970 wore on, the fractures within Chad deepened. President Tombalbaye's government tightened its grip on power, implementing policies that alienated even his allies. The people of Chad, weary from years of conflict, found themselves caught between the oppressive state and the relentless war. General Arnault, now more aware than ever of the complexities of the conflict, struggled to maintain morale among his troops. "This isn't just a military war," he remarked to Captain Delon during a late-night strategy session. "It's a battle for the soul of a nation, and we're intruders in that fight." Meanwhile, in the Tibesti Mountains, Ibrahim felt the weight of leadership pressing on him. His fighters were growing restless, supplies were scarce, and the villages that once supported them now hesitated. Ibrahim knew that if the people lost faith in the rebellion, their cause would falter. One evening, he gathered his men around a small campfire. "The French want us to break," he told them. "They want us to doubt our purpose. But we fight not just for ourselves but for our children and their future." His words stirred a glimmer of hope among the weary fighters, though the path ahead remained uncertain. The desert winds carried the scent of smoke as another French convoy moved through the barren landscape. After the defeat at Kufra, the rebels had shifted their tactics to hit-and-run attacks, targeting supply lines and small outposts. These skirmishes wore down French forces, draining resources and morale. One such ambush unfolded near the village of Aunianga. As the convoy moved cautiously along the narrow road, a hidden rebel unit sprang into action. Explosions erupted, throwing sand and debris into the air. Gunfire crackled as French soldiers scrambled for cover. In the chaos, Ibrahim led his fighters with precision, their knowledge of the terrain giving them an edge. Despite their ferocity, the French managed to regroup, calling in air support that turned the tide of the battle. As helicopters arrived, their cannons blazed, forcing the rebels to retreat. The aftermath was grim. Vehicles lay in ruins, and bodies, both French and rebel, dotted the battlefield. Among the survivors was Captain Delon, his arm bandaged and his face hardened. "They're bleeding us dry," he muttered to Arnaud, who could only nod in agreement. In the wake of the ambush, the French forces intensified their efforts to cut off rebel supply lines. Villages suspected of aiding the insurgents were raided, their resources seized or destroyed. These actions further strained relations between the French and the Chadian population. Aminata's village became one such target. French soldiers swept through, searching homes and questioning villagers. Though Aminata pleaded her innocence, the soldiers confiscated what little food she had left. She watched helplessly as her neighbors were rounded up, accused of harboring rebels. The incident left the village shattered. "They see us all as enemies," one elder lamented. Aminata, holding her child close, felt a growing anger. "We are not rebels," she thought, "but we are treated as if we are." Back in the French camp, Arnaud reviewed reports of these raids with a heavy heart. He understood the necessity of cutting off rebel support, but he also knew that every harsh action pushed the people further away. "This war is a snake eating its own tail," he told Colonel Dubois. "The more we fight, the more we lose." By early 1971, the French command began to shift its focus. With mounting pressure from Paris and dwindling resources, Arnaud received orders to prepare for a gradual withdrawal. The goal was no longer to win the war but to stabilize the region enough for Chadian forces to take over. Arnaud convened his officers to discuss the transition. "We cannot leave this country in chaos," he said firmly. "Our exit must be orderly, and we must ensure that Tombouctet's government can hold its ground." But as the French planned their exit, Ibrahim and his fighters saw an opportunity. "If they're leaving," he told his men, "then we must prepare for the next phase of our fight. Chad's freedom is within reach." In Fort Lamy, Tombouctet viewed the French withdrawal with a mix of relief and apprehension. While he resented their interference, he feared losing the protection they provided. Secretly, he began consolidating power, preparing for the day when Chad would face its future alone. The desert remained quiet for now, but beneath the surface, the seeds of the next conflict were already taking root. The announcement of a gradual French withdrawal sent ripples across Chad. In Fort Lamy, President Tombouctet convened his inner circle, determined to use the transition to solidify his control. His vision was clear, a centralized government with no room for dissent. To this end, he ordered sweeping reforms, including tighter control over the military and civil service. General Arnault, wary of Tombobey's authoritarian tendencies, insisted on strict conditions for the handover. If we leave power unchecked, he warned, this country will implode. His officers worked tirelessly to train Chadian forces, but the lack of resources and internal divisions within the government made progress slow. Meanwhile, the rebels saw the withdrawal as both a victory and a challenge. Ibrahim, recognizing the shift in dynamics, began rallying support from disillusioned villagers. The French may be leaving, he told them, but our struggle is not over. We must stand ready to face whatever comes next. The people of Chad, weary from years of conflict, watched these developments with trepidation. For Aminata, the French withdrawal brought no relief, only uncertainty. If they leave, she wondered, will it bring peace or more chaos? As 1971 unfolded, the French prepared for one final offensive to weaken the rebels before their departure. Intelligence suggested that a large rebel force was gathering near the Fada region. General Arnault saw this as an opportunity to deal a decisive blow and ensure a smoother transition. The operation was meticulously planned. Helicopters would provide air support, while ground troops advanced in coordinated waves. Arnault addressed his men the night before the mission, his tone somber. This is not just another battle, he said. It is our last stand in this war. Fight with honor. At dawn, the French forces launched their attack. The rebels, though outnumbered, fought fiercely, their determination unwavering. The desert erupted in chaos as gunfire and explosions echoed across the sands. Ibrahim, leading his men from the front, refused to retreat despite the overwhelming odds. The battle raged for hours, each side suffering heavy casualties. By nightfall, the French had captured the rebel position, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Arnault surveyed the battlefield, the bodies of soldiers and rebels alike strewn across the sands. This is not triumph, he muttered. It is tragedy. In July 1971, the French began withdrawing their forces. The departure was marked by quiet ceremonies, the soldiers departing with a mix of relief and regret. General Arnault, his tenure marked by hard decisions and haunting memories, was among the last to leave. As his plane lifted off from Fort Lamy, he gazed out at the desert below, wondering if their efforts had made any difference. In the capital, Tombobey seized the moment to consolidate his power. French advisors remained, but their influence waned. The Chadian president, emboldened by the absence of foreign oversight, tightened his grip on the country, implementing policies that alienated many. For the rebels, the French withdrawal was a bittersweet moment. They had outlasted a powerful foreign army, but the struggle for Chad's future was far from over. Ibrahim, now a seasoned leader, prepared his men for the next phase of their fight. This land is ours, he told them. No one can take it from us. As the dust settled on Operation BISON, Chad entered a new chapter of its history. The French departure left a power vacuum that Tombobey sought to fill with authoritarian rule. His policies sparked dissent, and the seeds of future conflicts began to take root. In the Tibesti Mountains, Ibrahim and his rebels regrouped, their determination undiminished. They began forging alliances with other factions, their vision of a free Chad driving them forward. For the villagers caught in the middle, the war's end brought little relief. Aminata, now struggling to rebuild her life, reflected on the years of loss. We have survived, she whispered to her child, but at what cost? General Arnault returned to France, carrying the weight of a war he could not forget. He spent his remaining years advocating for better policies in former colonies, his experiences in Chad shaping his views. "We cannot impose peace," he wrote in his memoirs. "It must come from within." The desert, vast and eternal, bore the scars of the conflict but remained indifferent to the lives it had consumed. For Chad, the end of Operation Bison was not the end of its struggles but a turning point in a story that would continue to unfold. The story of Operation Savannah. In the quiet villages of Angola, whispers of change rode the winds. It was 1975, a year drenched in uncertainty. The nation had just emerged from Portuguese colonial rule, but the battle for power among the liberation movements, MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA, had intensified. Across the plains and forests, alliances were being forged, and rivalries deepened, with ordinary lives hanging in the balance. South of Angola, in PROTEA, the South African government watched these developments with unease. The MPLA, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, posed a potential threat to its northern borders. The apartheid regime, steeped in its fears of communism, decided to act preemptively. Secret meetings unfolded in shadowed rooms, where military leaders mapped Operation Savannah, a bold yet perilous intervention to support the anti-MPLA factions. On a crisp October morning, soldiers gathered under the banner of Task Force Zulu, one of the units assigned to the operation. Among them was Commandant Jan Breitenbach, a seasoned officer known for his unyielding determination. He surveyed his men, farmers, mechanics, and teachers turned soldiers, and wondered if they understood the complexities of the war they were about to enter. Meanwhile, in Havana, a group of Cuban advisors prepared for their own mission. Fidel Castro had pledged support to the MPLA, seeing Angola as a crucial theater in the global Cold War. For Lieutenant Miguel Fernandez, this deployment was an opportunity to serve his country and confront imperialism. Yet, as the ship left port, a gnawing doubt lingered in his mind about the human cost of their involvement. The dry Angolan savanna stretched endlessly before the men of Task Force Zulu. The convoy of armored vehicles rumbled through the golden grasslands, leaving behind a trail of dust. The soldiers carried their rifles with a mixture of nervous energy and determination. Among them was Corporal Piet van Zyl, a young farmer from the Free State who had never ventured beyond South Africa's borders. Now, he found himself in a foreign land, unsure of the battles ahead. Their first objective was the town of Pereira Deca, modern-day Angiva. Intelligence reports indicated it was lightly defended by MPLA forces. Commandant Breitenbach issued his orders with calm authority, emphasizing speed and surprise. As the convoy approached, tension crackled in the air. Pete gripped his rifle tightly, his heart pounding in rhythm with the hum of the engines. The attack began just before dawn. South African artillery roared to life, sending shells crashing into the MPLA positions. As the sun rose, Task Force Zulu advanced, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Pete was thrust into the chaos of battle, the sound of gunfire and the cries of the wounded filling the air. When the fighting ended, the town lay in ruins, and the MPLA defenders had retreated. For Pete, the victory felt hollow, the price of war already weighing heavily on his shoulders. Miles away, in Luanda, MPLA commanders regrouped. News of the South African advance spread quickly, and reinforcements were mobilized. Among them was Maria Almeida, a nurse who had joined the MPLA's medical corps. Her role was to tend to the wounded, but as she packed her supplies, she couldn't ignore the growing dread in her heart. The war was escalating, and its toll on the people was becoming unbearable. The political undercurrents of Operation Savannah were as turbulent as the battles themselves. In Washington, D.C., CIA operatives worked covertly to funnel support to UNITA and FNLA, the anti-MPLA factions. The U.S. government, determined to counter Soviet influence in Africa, saw Angola as a critical front in the Cold War. For CIA officer James Harrington, the mission was clear, but the morality of their actions was far less so. Sitting in a dimly lit office, he reviewed the latest reports from the field, the lines of his face etched with the weight of decisions made in secrecy. In contrast, the MPLA's allies moved with open confidence. Cuban troops disembarked in Luanda, welcomed by cheering crowds. Miguel Fernandez and his comrades marveled at the warmth of the reception, but they knew this was only the beginning. Their mission was to train MPLA forces and hold back the South African advance. As Miguel stepped off the ship, he steeled himself for the battles ahead, unaware of the personal trials that awaited him. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union increased its support for the MPLA. Shipments of weapons and advisors arrived in Angola, bolstering their defenses. For Maria Almeida, the influx of aid brought hope, but it also meant more casualties. As the wounded poured into her field hospital, she worked tirelessly, her hands steady even as her heart ached. The faces of the soldiers haunted her dreams, each one a reminder of the human cost of the war. On the ground, Task Force Zulu continued its march. The victories came quickly, but the resistance grew stronger. Commandant Breitenbach understood the risks of overextension, but orders from Pretoria were clear: push forward and secure as much territory as possible. For Piet van Zyl and his comrades, the thrill of initial success was fading, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged conflict. By November 1975, the war in Angola had reached a critical juncture. South African forces had made significant gains, but the MPLA's response was swift and coordinated. Cuban reinforcements arrived in greater numbers, and the balance of power began to shift. The Battle of Ebo would mark a turning point, a clash that revealed the limits of South Africa's ambitions. Task Force Zulu approached Ebo with confidence, their morale bolstered by recent successes. The plan was straightforward: overwhelm the MPLA defenders with superior firepower and capture the strategic town. But unknown to them, the MPLA, aided by Cuban advisors, had fortified their positions and prepared an ambush. As the South African forces advanced, they encountered fierce resistance. Artillery fire rained down on their columns, and the dense vegetation made maneuvering difficult. Pete found himself caught in the chaos, the sounds of battle overwhelming his senses. For the first time, he felt the sting of fear, the realization that victory was far from certain. The battle raged for hours, with neither side willing to yield. In the end, the South Africans were forced to retreat, their losses heavy. The MPLA's victory at Ebo was celebrated as a triumph, a testament to their resolve and the effectiveness of their Cuban allies. For Miguel Fernandez, the sight of the South Africans retreating brought a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the casualties they had suffered. Back in Pretoria, the mood was somber. The political and military leadership grappled with the implications of the setback. For Commandant Breitenbach, the retreat was a bitter pill to swallow, but he remained focused on the mission. For Pete, the experience of Ebo left an indelible mark, a reminder of the fragility of life and the cost of war. In the dimly lit war room of Pretoria, South Africa's military leaders reviewed the latest reports from the Angolan front. Maps sprawled across the table, marked with red and blue arrows that traced the progress of Task Force Zulu. The defeat at Ebo had shaken their confidence, but retreat was not an option. Orders were issued for reinforcements, and the focus shifted to consolidating gains in southern Angola. Colonel Jan Mallon was among those summoned to lead a new offensive. A veteran of numerous border skirmishes, Malin understood the complexities of guerrilla warfare. He reviewed the plans with a grim expression, knowing full well the challenges his troops faced. Speed and precision, he told his subordinates. We must strike hard and disappear before they can react. Meanwhile, on the MPLA's side, the victory at Ibo had galvanized their forces. Agostinho Neto, the MPLA's leader, declared that Angola would remain united under his movement. Soviet advisors worked tirelessly to arm and train MPLA soldiers, while Cuban commanders devised strategies to counter South African incursions. Miguel Fernandez, now embedded with an MPLA battalion, marveled at the discipline of the Angolan fighters, many of whom were farmers and laborers mere months ago. In the quiet of her field hospital, Maria Almeida treated the aftermath of the battles. Wounded soldiers arrived in waves, their stories painting a vivid picture of the horrors of war. Despite the exhaustion that gnawed at her, Maria found strength in their resilience. She often wrote letters for those too weak to hold a pen, promising to deliver them to families who might never know the fate of their loved ones. As Task Force Zulu regrouped, Corporal Pete Van Zyl and his comrades prepared for another mission. The losses at Ibo had left a void in their ranks, and the new recruits were green and uncertain. Pete, now battle-hardened, tried to reassure them. "Stay close, follow orders, and you'll be fine," he said, though doubt lingered in his voice. The war was far from over, and the shadows of strategy loomed large over all involved. By late November 1975, the war in Angola had drawn the attention of the world. In the United Nations, debates raged over South Africa's involvement. Accusations of imperialism clashed with fears of communism, each side wielding propaganda like a weapon. For James Harrington, the CIA operative in Washington, the stakes had never been higher. His mission to supply UNITA and FNLA with weapons and intelligence had become a delicate balancing act. "Every move we make is being watched," he told his team. But failure isn't an option. On the ground, the lines between allies and adversaries blurred. Zairian troops fighting alongside UNITA struggled to adapt to the demands of the Angolan terrain. Their commander, General Mobutu, was known more for his political maneuvers than his military acumen. Task Force Zulu found themselves increasingly reliant on UNITA's local knowledge, forging an uneasy alliance with Jonas Savimbi's forces. Savimbi, charismatic and cunning, saw the South Africans as a means to an end. "Our goals align for now," he told his men. "But remember, this is our land, and we fight for Angola." The MPLA, bolstered by Cuban reinforcements, intensified their counteroffensives. In the small town of Sela, Miguel Fernandez led a reconnaissance mission. The Cuban advisor had grown close to his Angolan counterparts, sharing meals and stories that bridged their cultural divide. One evening, as they prepared for a night patrol, Miguel reflected on the irony of their situation. "We're thousands of miles from home, yet we fight as if this soil is our own," he said to a fellow officer. The reply came softly, "It is, for as long as we stand together." Pete Van Zyl, now a seasoned soldier, felt the weight of the war's complexities. During a rare moment of respite, he sat under a baobab tree, polishing his rifle. A Zairian fighter approached, offering a crude map of the area. Despite the language barrier, they communicated with gestures and broken words, finding common ground in their shared struggle. Pete wondered how many of these fragile alliances would endure once the dust of war settled. Bridge 14, a critical crossing over the Naya River, became the focal point of the conflict in December 1975. The structure connected southern Angola's rugged interior to key supply routes, and both sides recognized its strategic importance. For the South Africans, its capture was essential to maintain their advance. For the MPLA and their Cuban allies, it was a line that could not be crossed. Task Force Zulu approached the bridge with caution, their movements shrouded in the pre-dawn mist. Colonel Mallon's plan was meticulous, relying on a swift, coordinated assault. Pete Van Zyl found himself at the forefront of the operation, tasked with securing the northern bank. "Keep your head down and stay sharp," his sergeant whispered as they moved into position. The battle erupted with sudden ferocity. South African artillery pounded the MPLA defenses, while Cuban troops returned fire with equal intensity. Miguel Fernandez directed his men from a makeshift bunker, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The ground shook with each explosion, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. As the hours dragged on, the South Africans gained ground, but the MPLA's resolve held firm. Maria Almeida, stationed at a nearby field hospital, worked tirelessly to save the lives of those caught in the crossfire. Her hands moved with practiced precision, yet her heart broke with each casualty she could not save. "Another son, another brother lost," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the din of war. When the fighting finally subsided, Bridge 14 remained under MPLA control. The South African forces withdrew, their spirits dampened but not broken. For Miguel, the victory was bittersweet. The losses weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake the image of a young soldier clutching a photo of his family in his final moments. Pete, too, felt the sting of defeat, but he found solace in the camaraderie of his unit. "We'll fight another day," he told his comrades, though the words felt hollow. The year was drawing to a close, but the war in Angola showed no signs of abating. The MPLA had declared itself the legitimate government of Angola in November 1975, but the country remained a battleground. Villages were emptied as families fled from advancing forces, leaving behind their homes, their livestock, and sometimes their loved ones. The war consumed everything it touched, turning Angola's once thriving plains into fields of sorrow. For Maria Almeida, the war's impact was deeply personal. In the rare moments of quiet at her field hospital, she would think of her family, scattered across the country. Her letters often went unanswered, and she feared the worst. Despite her exhaustion, she found purpose in caring for the wounded. Each life she saved felt like a small victory, a defiance of the chaos around her. On the South African side, morale was strained. Task Force Zulu's successes were overshadowed by their growing casualties and the realization that their advance had stalled. Corporal Pete Van Zyl, once full of youthful energy, now bore the weary expression of a soldier who had seen too much. His letters home were filled with reassurances, but he could not bring himself to describe the horrors of battle. "It's better they don't know," he told himself as he folded a letter to his mother. In Luanda, Miguel Fernandez and his fellow Cuban advisors worked to strengthen the MPLA's defenses. The Cuban presence in Angola had grown significantly, with thousands of troops deployed to aid their allies. Miguel admired the resilience of the Angolan fighters but was haunted by the weight of responsibility. He knew that every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death for the men under his command. As 1975 gave way to 1976, the war showed no signs of resolution. Each side dug in deeper, their objectives fueled by ideology, strategy, and survival. For the people of Angola, the war was no longer about politics or power. It was about endurance, about finding a way to live amidst the ruins of a nation torn apart. In early 1976, the arrival of more Cuban reinforcements shifted the dynamics of the war. The MPLA's forces, bolstered by Soviet weaponry and Cuban expertise, launched a series of counteroffensives that tested South Africa's resolve. For Fidel Castro, Angola had become a symbol of resistance against imperialism. The Cuban leader monitored the situation closely, his orders clear: hold the line at all costs. One such counteroffensive targeted the South African-held town of Sela. Miguel Fernandez was tasked with coordinating the assault. As his unit prepared to advance, he addressed his men. This is not just a battle for Angola. It is a battle for the dignity of all who stand against oppression. His words ignited a spark of determination among the troops, who marched forward with a renewed sense of purpose. The attack on Sela was fierce and unrelenting. South African forces, though outnumbered, fought valiantly to hold their position. Piet van Zyl found himself in the thick of the fighting, his rifle shaking in his hands. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of burning vehicles, and the cries of the wounded. For Piet, each second felt like an eternity, each step a struggle against fear. The battle raged for hours, with heavy losses on both sides. By nightfall, the South Africans had withdrawn, and the MPLA forces celebrated their hard-won victory. Miguel Fernandez walked among the wreckage, his heart heavy with the cost of their success. He paused to help an injured Angolan soldier, his actions a small act of humanity amidst the devastation. In PROTEA, news of the defeat at Sela sent shockwaves through the government. The military leadership grappled with the growing realization that their ambitions in Angola might be unsustainable. For Colonel Mallon, the losses were a bitter reminder of the war's unpredictability. We underestimated them, he admitted in a meeting. And now we pay the price. By mid-January 1976, the tide of the war had turned decisively against the South Africans. The MPLA, with Cuban and Soviet support, launched coordinated attacks that pushed Task Force Zulu further south. For the men on the ground, the retreat was grueling. Convoys moved through dense jungles and dry savannas, harried by enemy ambushes and the ever-present threat of landmines. Corporal Piet van Zyl marched with his unit, his body weary from days of fighting and little rest. The camaraderie among his comrades was the only thing keeping him going. They shared stories of home, jokes to lighten the mood, and silent nods of solidarity. Yet, the fear of being left behind in the chaos of retreat was never far from their minds. Maria Almeida's field hospital had become a sanctuary for those fleeing the war. She worked tirelessly to treat the wounded and comfort the grieving. One evening, as she tended to a young boy who had lost his family, she felt the weight of the war pressing down on her. "When will this end?" she whispered to no one in particular. The boy looked up at her with wide, tearful eyes, and she resolved to keep fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. As the South Africans crossed the border back into Namibia, the MPLA celebrated what they saw as a decisive victory. Miguel Fernandez stood with his comrades, watching as the last of the South African vehicles disappeared over the horizon. The war was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope for Angola's future. He thought of the friends he had lost and the sacrifices they had made, and he vowed to honor their memory by continuing the fight. For Angola, the end of Operation Savannah was not the end of the war. The country remained a battlefield, its people caught in the crossfire of competing ideologies. But amidst the ruins, there was a sense of resilience, a determination to rebuild and reclaim their future. As Piet van Zyl looked back on the land he had left behind, he wondered if he would ever return, and if Angola would ever find peace. The Angolan countryside bore the scars of battle, burnt-out vehicles, abandoned villages, and fields once fertile, now trampled by war. For the MPLA and their Cuban allies, the retreat of South African forces was a significant victory. Yet, the conflict was far from over. The Angolan Civil War continued to rage, fueled by Cold War rivalries and deep-seated internal divisions. In Luanda, Agostinho Neto addressed his government. "We have repelled the invaders, but Angola remains fragile," he declared. His words reflected a grim truth. While the MPLA had solidified its hold on the capital and key regions, UNITA and FNLA forces, backed by South Africa and the United States, continued their insurgency in the countryside. Maria Almeida worked tirelessly in her makeshift hospital, tending to both soldiers and civilians. One afternoon, she received a young girl who had stepped on a landmine while gathering firewood. Maria's hands trembled as she cleaned the wounds, her heart breaking at the child's silent tears. "How many more will suffer before this ends?" she thought, her resolve to help unwavering despite the growing despair. In Havana, Fidel Castro hailed the Cuban contribution to the MPLA's success as a triumph of international solidarity. Miguel Fernandez, now a seasoned advisor, was sent to a remote province to help train Angolan recruits. He found himself drawn to the stories of the villagers who had lost everything yet continued to resist. Each tale deepened his commitment to the cause, though the weight of responsibility grew heavier with every passing day. By early 1976, the MPLA's attention turned to securing the interior regions of Angola. The provinces of Wambo and Benguela, rich in resources and strategic value, remained contested. The South African-backed UNITA forces, led by Jonas Savimbi, had entrenched themselves in these areas, determined to hold their ground. Miguel Fernandez arrived in Wambo to oversee the training of local MPLA forces. He was struck by the determination of the recruits, many of whom were young men and women who had never held a weapon before. As they practiced drills under the scorching sun, Miguel reminded them, "This is not just about fighting. It's about protecting your homes, your families, and your future." In the dense jungles of Wambo, UNITA fighters waged a guerrilla war against MPLA forces. Corporal Pete Van Zyl, now back in Namibia, read reports of the ongoing skirmishes. Though far from the front lines, he felt a strange connection to the conflict he had left behind. Memories of his time in Angola haunted his nights, and he often wondered if the war would ever truly end. For Maria Almeida, the war's reach seemed endless. Her field hospital, now relocated to Benguela, struggled to keep up with the influx of wounded. One evening, she sat by the bedside of an MPLA soldier who had lost his leg in an ambush. He spoke of his dreams of becoming a teacher, his voice filled with quiet determination. Maria smiled softly, her own hope renewed by his resilience. The Angolan conflict continued to draw the attention of global powers. In Washington, the CIA ramped up its support for UNITA and FNLA, funneling weapons and funds through covert channels. James Harrington, the veteran operative, met with his team to discuss their strategy. "Angola is a piece on the chessboard," he said. "And we can't afford to let it fall to the Soviets." In Moscow, Soviet advisors reviewed updates from Angola with equal urgency. The MPLA's survival was seen as a critical component of their Cold War strategy. Shipments of arms and supplies flowed steadily into Luanda, bolstering the MPLA's ability to fight. For Miguel Fernandez, the presence of Soviet advisors brought both relief and unease. Their support was invaluable, but their methods often clashed with the realities on the ground. The South African government, under mounting international pressure, faced a dilemma. The cost of their involvement in Angola was rising, both economically and politically. Yet, the fear of a communist Angola remained a driving force. In Pretoria, military leaders debated their next steps, their voices heavy with the weight of the decisions before them. Meanwhile, on the ground, alliances shifted and fractured. In one village, Maria Almeida watched as MPLA soldiers worked alongside Cuban advisors to rebuild homes destroyed in the fighting. It was a rare moment of unity amidst the chaos, a reminder of what they were fighting for. If only this could last, Maria thought, though she knew the war would not let them rest for long. In mid-1976, Benguela became the site of one of the most intense battles of the war. The city, a vital transportation hub, was contested fiercely by MPLA and UNITA forces. For the MPLA, holding Benguela was essential to securing the western provinces. For UNITA, it was a chance to deal a crippling blow to their rivals. Miguel Fernandez arrived in Benguela to assist in its defense. The city was a maze of narrow streets and crumbling buildings, its population caught in the crossfire. Miguel worked closely with local commanders, devising strategies to repel the UNITA assault. As the first shots rang out, he steeled himself for the fight ahead. The siege lasted for weeks, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Maria Almeida's hospital was overwhelmed with casualties, her team working day and night to save lives. She moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, her voice calm as she directed her staff. Yet, every life lost weighed on her, a constant reminder of the war's relentless toll. For Pete Van Zyl, news of the siege brought a mix of relief and guilt. He was safe in Namibia, far from the violence, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had abandoned those still fighting. Late at night, he would sit by the campfire, staring into the flames and wondering if he had made the right choices. When the siege finally ended, the MPLA emerged victorious, but the cost was staggering. Benguela lay in ruins, its people left to rebuild amidst the devastation. Miguel walked through the city, his heart heavy with the weight of what they had endured. "We've won," he told himself. But at what price? As the siege of Benguela faded into memory, the war's reach continued to expand. Across Angola, the conflict fractured communities and left scars that would take generations to heal. New battles emerged in the eastern provinces, where rich diamond fields became critical assets for UNITA's funding. For the MPLA, controlling this region was essential to asserting their authority over the country. Miguel Fernandez, now a trusted advisor to MPLA forces, was sent to Lunda province, where diamond mines had become a flashpoint for violence. He marveled at the region's natural beauty, its lush greenery contrasting sharply with the devastation wrought by the war. Yet, Miguel knew the beauty hid a brutal struggle beneath. UNITA fighters had fortified positions around key mines, and the MPLA's task was to dislodge them. The fighting in Lunda was intense and unrelenting. Miguel worked closely with Angolan commanders to plan an offensive, but the dense jungle terrain made progress slow and perilous. Ambushes were common, and each step forward came at a heavy cost. One night, as he reviewed maps by lantern light, Miguel overheard a young soldier praying for his family's safety. The moment reminded him of his own family in Cuba, and he resolved to push forward despite the odds. Meanwhile, Maria Almeida remained in Benguela, where her field hospital served as a beacon of hope for the war-weary population. Supplies were scarce, and Maria often relied on the resourcefulness of her staff to make do with what they had. She found herself growing closer to the people she served, their resilience inspiring her to continue her work. If they can endure this, she thought, then so can I. In the corridors of power far from Angola's battlefields, the war was increasingly a matter of diplomacy. In Washington, James Harrington met with his superiors to discuss the situation. "We're funding UNITA and FNLA, but the MPLA's hold is growing stronger," he admitted. Cuban and Soviet support has turned the tide in their favor. The tension in the room was palpable as strategies were debated. At the United Nations, representatives from various countries voiced their concerns. The MPLA's allies painted South Africa's involvement as a violation of Angola's sovereignty, while South Africa and its backers framed the war as a fight against communism. Behind closed doors, deals were struck, and alliances were tested. In Pretoria, the South African government faced mounting pressure both domestically and internationally. The war was costly, and the loss of life weighed heavily on public opinion. Yet, the fear of a communist Angola remained a powerful motivator. Military leaders continued to plan covert operations, their sights set on destabilizing the MPLA wherever possible. For Miguel Fernandez, the war's diplomatic dimensions felt distant and abstract. On the ground, the struggle was visceral, immediate, and deeply personal. Yet, he understood that decisions made in faraway capitals shaped the lives of everyone in Angola. One evening, as he listened to a radio broadcast about international debates over the war, Miguel wondered how much longer the world would use Angola as a pawn in its geopolitical games. In the summer of 1976, the MPLA turned its attention to Manang, a strategic town in southern Angola. Securing Manang would weaken UNITA's grip on the region and disrupt their supply lines. The journey there, however, was fraught with danger. The road to Manang was lined with mines and ambush points, making every mile a test of endurance and resolve. Miguel Fernandez joined an MPLA convoy tasked with reinforcing the Manang offensive. The vehicles crawled through the rugged terrain, their progress slowed by constant vigilance. At night, the soldiers camped under the stars, their conversations a mix of laughter and whispers about the dangers ahead. Miguel often found himself staring into the flames of the campfire, thinking of the people they were fighting to protect. Corporal Piet van Zyl, stationed in Namibia, received word of the MPLA's push toward Manang. Though far from the front, he couldn't ignore the growing reports of MPLA victories. For Piet, the war felt like a distant yet inescapable shadow. He wrote a letter to his family, struggling to put his feelings into words. "I've seen too much, yet I feel like I've done too little," he wrote. Maria Almeida, now overseeing a network of field hospitals, prepared for the influx of casualties that would inevitably follow the battle for Manang. Her staff worked tirelessly to stockpile supplies and train local volunteers. As the days stretched on, Maria found herself drawn to the stories of those she treated. Each one deepened her understanding of the war's impact on ordinary lives, fueling her determination to keep going. The assault on Manang began with a series of coordinated strikes by MPLA forces. Artillery roared to life, lighting up the night sky as soldiers advanced through dense vegetation. Miguel Fernandez moved with his unit, his voice steady as he issued orders. The terrain was unforgiving, the enemy resilient, but the MPLA pressed forward, driven by the knowledge of what was at stake. UNITA fighters, well acquainted with the landscape, mounted a fierce defense. They used the dense jungle to their advantage, launching ambushes that stalled the MPLA's progress. For Miguel, the battle was a grim reminder of the cost of war. He saw comrades fall, their lives cut short in the pursuit of victory. Yet, he pushed on, his resolve unshaken. Maria Almeida's worst fears were realized as the wounded poured into her hospitals. She worked long hours, her hands moving with practiced precision as she treated burns, bullet wounds, and shattered limbs. Each patient was a story of survival, a testament to the human spirit's resilience. Late at night, as she cleaned her instruments, Maria whispered a prayer for the men and women still fighting. After days of brutal combat, the MPLA forces captured Manang. The victory was celebrated as a significant achievement, a step toward securing the region. Yet, for Miguel, the joy was tempered by the memories of those who had fallen. Standing on the outskirts of the town, He watched the Angolan flag rise over the ruins and vowed to honor their sacrifice. The story of Operation ASKARI. It was December 1983, and the dense Angolan bush shimmered under a scorching sun, the humid air thick with the tension of a brewing conflict. The South African Defence Force, SADF, had begun assembling its forces for Operation ASKARI, a cross-border military campaign designed to disrupt the activities of SWAPO's military wing, Plan, People's Liberation Army of Namibia. The operation would span from December 8, 1983, to January 13, 1984, leaving an indelible mark on the region's history. In the shadows of this larger confrontation were soldiers, commanders, and civilians, each drawn into the vortex of war. Their lives, distinct yet interwoven, formed the fabric of this story. The South African border war had raged for decades, a low-intensity conflict that was as much about ideology as it was about territory. Angola, the base of Plan's operations, had become a crucial battlefield. South Africa viewed Plan's growing strength as a direct threat to its control over Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia. In Pretoria, high-ranking SADF officials pored over maps and intelligence reports. The plans for Operation ASKARI had taken shape after months of reconnaissance. General Jan du Plessis, an experienced commander with a stern demeanor, briefed his officers with precise instructions. "We strike their command and logistics. No mercy," he said, his voice cutting through the humid war room. Far to the north, in Plan's bases near Quitieve and Kuvali, young fighters prepared for what they knew was an inevitable confrontation. Among them was Amadou, a farmer's son turned guerrilla. His AK-47 rested by his side as he watched the sun set, its fiery hues a stark contrast to the unease gnawing at him. "If they come, we fight," his friend Joaquin whispered. But the unspoken fear in their eyes betrayed the bravado. The border region was a crucible, where the ambitions of nations clashed with the hopes and fears of individuals. The SADF's mechanized convoys began moving northward in the early hours of December 8. Dust clouds rose as armored personnel carriers and radals, armored fighting vehicles, rumbled forward. Captain Johan Botha, a young officer with dreams of glory, led a platoon. "Stay alert, men," he commanded, his voice steady despite the nerves tightening his stomach. Their mission was to disrupt Plan's command structures and eliminate caches of weapons and supplies. The journey was fraught with danger, hidden mines, ambushes, and the ever-present specter of guerrilla resistance. Meanwhile, in the village of Kahama, Maria, a local schoolteacher, gathered her students into a makeshift shelter. The conflict had upended their lives, but she clung to the hope that one day, the guns would fall silent. Her brother, a Plan fighter, had sent word days earlier, urging her to flee. But Maria had nowhere to go. By nightfall, the SADF forces had crossed into Angola. The first skirmishes erupted near Quitieve as Plan fighters ambushed the advancing South African troops. Gunfire echoed through the bush, and the acrid smell of cordite filled the air. Amid the chaos, Amadou and his comrades found themselves locked in a desperate fight to hold their ground. The early morning sun broke through the dense Angolan bush, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. In the distance, the crackle of gunfire signaled the beginning of a confrontation that would test the mettle of both sides. At Quitieve, the SADF's vanguard met fierce resistance as Plan fighters, entrenched in well-camouflaged positions, launched a surprise ambush. Captain Johan Botha's platoon found themselves pinned down, their radals immobilized by a maze of anti-tank mines. "Contact left. Return fire," Johan yelled, his voice cutting through the din of battle. His men scrambled into action, their rifles rattling in response to the enemy fire. The terrain favored the defenders, with thick vegetation and concealed trenches offering ample cover. Amadou, crouched behind a fallen tree, fired his AK-47 in controlled bursts. The weapon's recoil bit into his shoulder, but he held steady, his eyes locked on the advancing South African soldiers. Around him, comrades shouted orders and encouragement, their voices a patchwork of determination and desperation. The skirmish raged for hours, each side gaining and losing ground. By mid-afternoon, the SADF had managed to flank the planned positions, forcing the fighters to retreat deeper into the bush. Exhausted and battered, Johann's men regrouped, their faces etched with the stark reality of war. As the SADF advanced toward Kuvali, the pace of operations quickened. The heat was oppressive, and the soldiers battled not just the enemy but also the harsh environment. Dust clung to their sweat-drenched uniforms, and the relentless hum of mosquitoes filled the air. In the bush, planned fighters regrouped, guided by seasoned commanders who understood the terrain better than their adversaries. Among them was Commander Elias, a veteran of countless battles. "We know these lands," he told his men. "Use them. Make them pay for every step they take." For Maria, the fighting was getting too close for comfort. At Kahama, the village was abuzz with rumors of advancing troops. She decided to gather what little she could and prepare her students for a journey to safety. The children's laughter, once a source of joy, now seemed fragile against the backdrop of war. Back in the SADF camp, Johann and his fellow officers debated their next move. Intelligence reports hinted at a large planned force amassing near Kuvali. "We can't afford to get bogged down," Johann argued, but doubts lingered. The bush was unpredictable, and the enemy elusive. On December 31, 1983, the SADF launched a major assault on Kuvali, a planned stronghold. The town, nestled in a strategic location, had been fortified with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. For planned, it was a bastion of resistance; for the SADF, a critical objective. The assault began with a heavy artillery barrage, the thunderous explosions shaking the earth. Amadou huddled in a bunker, his heart pounding as debris rained down. "Hold the line!" Commander Elias shouted, rallying his men. The planned fighters, though outgunned, fought with tenacity born of desperation. The SAD's mechanized columns pushed forward, their radals leading the charge. Johann's platoon was in the thick of the fight, maneuvering through a deadly gauntlet of machine gun fire and rocket-propelled grenades. "Move! Move!" Johann bellowed, his voice hoarse from shouting. The battle lasted into the night, the darkness punctuated by the flashes of gunfire and explosions. By dawn, the SADF had captured the town, but the cost was high. The bodies of soldiers and planned fighters lay scattered, a grim testament to the ferocity of the clash. The fall of Kuvali marked a turning point in Operation ASKARI, but the victory came at a steep price. The SAD supply lines were stretched thin, and morale among the troops was beginning to waver. Johann, now scarred by the realities of war, wrote a letter to his family, his words heavy with the burden of what he had seen. Amadou, wounded but alive, trudged through the bush with a handful of survivors. They carried their injured comrades on makeshift stretchers, their resolve unbroken despite the loss. "This is not the end," Commander Elias assured them. "We will fight again." In Kahama, Maria and her students had taken refuge in a nearby village. The sight of the fleeing fighters filled her with dread, but she knew she had to stay strong for the children. Her brother, Joachim, had not returned, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. For both sides, the war was far from over. The bush remained a battlefield, its silence a deceptive prelude to the next confrontation. The dense Angolan bush had reclaimed Kivali's outskirts, a grim reminder of the battle that had raged there. For the SADF, the victory was bittersweet. Supplies were dwindling, and the troops were exhausted. Captain Johann Botha felt the weight of his decisions more than ever. His platoon, reduced in number, bore the physical and emotional scars of combat. In the quiet hours before dawn, Johann met with his commanding officer. Orders were clear: press forward to eliminate remaining planned positions. "We can't afford to lose momentum," the officer said firmly. Johann nodded, masking his unease. The men needed rest, but war allowed no reprieve. Meanwhile, Amadou and his group found refuge in the jungle. Under Commander Elias' leadership, they worked tirelessly to regroup. They built new defenses, rationed supplies, and tended to the wounded. Amadou's injury throbbed with every movement, but he refused to complain. Survival was paramount, and each small act of resilience felt like defiance. Maria, still in Kahama's neighboring village, began gathering scraps of news from fleeing civilians. She learned that Joaquim's unit had been among those fighting at Kivala. Her heart sank, but she clung to the possibility that he might still be alive. With every passing day, her resolve to protect the children grew stronger. As the SADF advanced further into Angolan territory, they encountered new challenges. The terrain became increasingly treacherous, with hidden mines and ambushes a constant threat. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear paths, their movements slow and deliberate. Every step could mean death. Johann's platoon was tasked with scouting ahead for enemy positions. The men moved cautiously, their nerves frayed. In the quiet of the bush, every rustle of leaves felt like a harbinger of danger. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shattered the stillness. A mine had been triggered. Johann rushed to the scene, his heart sinking as he saw the aftermath. The loss hit hard, but the mission continued. As they moved deeper into planned territory, the tension was palpable. Johann's thoughts turned to his family back home. He wondered if they knew the reality of what he was enduring. In moments of silence, he found himself questioning the purpose of it all. For Amadou, the days were no easier. Planned fighters began laying new mines, using every resource at their disposal to slow the SAD's advance. Amadou watched as an older fighter, a man who had fought for years, carefully placed an anti-tank mine. "Every delay gives us a chance," the man said, his voice steady but weary. By early January, the SADF turned its attention to Kahama, a critical waypoint in planned supply network. The village, though small, had become a fortified position, bristling with defenses. For Maria, the sound of approaching artillery was a signal that her time had run out. She led the children further into the bush, hoping to find safety. The SADF launched their assault with precision. Artillery fire softened planned positions, and armored vehicles pushed forward under the cover of smoke. Johann's platoon was tasked with securing the southern flank. The fighting was intense, with every inch of ground fiercely contested. Amadou and his comrades fought with everything they had. Their resolve was unshaken, but the sheer power of the SAD's assault was overwhelming. Commander Elias directed his men with a calm authority, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Fall back, but do not break," he commanded. As the day wore on, the SADF gained the upper hand. By nightfall, they had taken Kahama, but not without heavy losses. Johann stood amid the ruins, the victory ringing hollow. The faces of his fallen comrades haunted him, their sacrifices etched into his memory. The aftermath of the battle left Kahama in ruins. The once bustling village was now a desolate wasteland, its streets littered with debris. Johann walked through the devastation, his thoughts heavy. Despite the triumph, he couldn't shake the sense that they were only treading water in an unending conflict. For Maria, the destruction was devastating. She returned cautiously, her heart sinking at the sight of her former home. She found a few surviving villagers, their faces gaunt with fear and exhaustion. Among them was a boy who handed her a tattered piece of cloth. It belonged to Joaquin. Though it wasn't definitive, it gave Maria a fragile thread of hope. Amadou and the planned fighters retreated deeper into the bush, their numbers reduced but their spirits unbroken. Elias gathered his men and spoke quietly. "We've lost a battle, not the war. We will rebuild. We will continue." His words were met with nods of agreement, though the pain in their eyes was unmistakable. The SADF prepared for the next phase of their operation, but the strain on resources and morale was beginning to show. Johann sat by the fire that night, staring into the flames. He thought of home, of the life he had left behind, and wondered if he would ever find peace. The SADF regrouped and began advancing toward their next objectives. Every step into Angola's heartland brought new challenges: mines, guerrilla ambushes, and the relentless terrain. The soldiers marched silently, their boots crunching the dry earth. The once high spirits of Johann Botha's platoon had given way to a quiet resolve born of necessity. At night, the men sat around makeshift fires, their faces illuminated by flickering light. Johann kept to himself, staring into the flames as if they held answers to the questions that plagued him. The letters he wrote to his family were left unsent, their words a mixture of longing and guilt. He wondered if they would ever understand what it meant to walk in the shadow of death. Amadou and his comrades, meanwhile, had begun what they called the Long March. Forced to abandon fortified positions, they navigated the bush with care. Each day was a test of endurance, hunger gnawing at their bellies and exhaustion threatening to overtake them. Still, they pressed on, fueled by a belief that their cause was righteous. For Maria, the march was a different kind of trial. Leading a group of children through the bush, she struggled to find food and water. Every distant explosion reminded her of the conflict's proximity. Yet, she pushed forward, telling stories to keep the children's spirits high, even as her own hope flickered like a dying ember. As the SADF pushed deeper into Angola, they came across villages abandoned in the wake of war. The scenes were haunting: empty huts, discarded belongings, and the echoes of lives disrupted. For Johann, it was a stark reminder of the human cost of their campaign. He walked through one such village, picking up a child's toy left in the dirt. It felt heavy in his hand, though it weighed almost nothing. Maria's group arrived in one of these abandoned villages, seeking refuge for the night. The children huddled together, their laughter replaced by silence. Maria found an old cooking pot and prepared a meager meal with what little she had. She told the children stories of peace, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Amadou and Elias also passed through these ghostly remnants of civilian life. For the fighters, it was a bitter sight. "This is what they've done to our people," Elias said, his voice tinged with both anger and sorrow. Amadou nodded, clutching his rifle tighter. Each step through these empty villages hardened his resolve. In PROTEA, the architects of Operation ASKARI reviewed reports from the field. Maps were marked with arrows and circles, the human element reduced to mere symbols. Decisions were made with calculated detachment, each move intended to tighten the noose around plan's operations. But the war was proving to be more complex than any map could convey. By January 10, 1984, the SADF achieved its primary objectives. plan's logistics and command structures had been disrupted, their fighters scattered. The final engagements near Tecumseh and Lunada were fierce but brief, as planned forces avoided prolonged battles. Johann's platoon was among the first to receive orders to stand down. For the SADF soldiers, there was no celebration. The victories felt hollow, the cost too great. Johann gathered his men and addressed them. "We did what we were sent to do," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. His words hung in the air, unanswered by the weary faces before him. Amadou's group, though battered, had survived. They listened as Elias laid out their next steps. "We regroup, we rebuild, and we resist," he declared. The fighters nodded solemnly, their determination unbroken despite the odds stacked against them. Amadou, now a seasoned fighter, felt the weight of his comrades' trust. Maria and the children finally reached a larger village, one untouched by the fighting. There, they found shelter and a semblance of safety. Maria met an older woman who had heard of a fighter named Joaquin in the region. Though it was only a rumor, it was enough to reignite her hope. The official end of Operation ASKARI came on January 13, 1984. The SADF withdrew, leaving behind a region scarred by conflict. In Pretoria, military leaders declared the operation a success, citing disrupted plan operations as evidence. Yet, on the ground, the reality was far more nuanced. Johann sat in a quiet corner of the camp, writing his final report. He described the bravery of his men, the challenges they faced, and the lives lost. But he also questioned the cost. "We won battles," he wrote, "but what have we truly gained?" Amadou, back at a hidden plan base, began training new recruits. He shared his experiences, his voice calm but firm. "They may have pushed us back, but they will never break us," he told them. For him, the fight was far from over. Maria, in the safety of the village, began to rebuild her life. She turned her attention to the children, ensuring they received an education despite the war's disruptions. Every day, she searched for news of her brother, clinging to the belief that he was still alive. For all involved, Operation ASKARI was not an end but in a much larger story. The war would continue, its shadows lingering over Angola and Southwest Africa. And within those shadows were countless lives, each bearing the weight of a conflict far larger than themselves. The story of Operation MEBOS. The year was 1982, and the air in southern Africa was tense with the echoes of conflict. The South African border war, a prolonged and grueling confrontation, had stretched on for years, gripping nations and lives in its relentless grasp. This was a war fought not only with guns and bombs but with ideologies, ambitions, and the dreams of nations seeking to carve their destinies. Within this grand tapestry of history, Operation MEBOS unfolded, a campaign designed to strike deep into the heart of Angola, where adversaries of the South African Defense Force, SADF, sought refuge. This story is not about a single hero. It is about the war itself, a living entity that shaped destinies, destroyed lives, and defined an era. Through the perspectives of soldiers, commanders, and the civilians caught in its wake, we journey into the heart of this historical campaign. From the humid Angolan jungles to the austere planning rooms of South African military strategists, the narrative brings to life the echoes of a time when the fate of nations hung precariously in the balance. The South African Defense Forces top brass convened in Pretoria in the early days of July 1982. A long mahogany table dominated the room, surrounded by stern-faced men in green uniforms adorned with medals that glinted under the cold fluorescent lights. At its head, General Jannie Geldenhuys leaned forward, his voice steady yet sharp. Intelligence confirms heightened activity by SWAPO and FAPLA forces near Kuvali. If we don't act now, they'll solidify their positions, making it impossible to contain them later. Colonel Peter Murray, a field commander with years of battle-hardened experience, nodded in agreement. They're using Angolan towns like Kuvali and Zangongo as springboards for incursions. We need to take the fight to them, disrupt their supply lines and dismantle their strongholds. Maps were spread across the table, revealing the intricate lines of terrain and the locations of enemy camps. The strategy was clear: Operation MEBOS would involve swift and calculated cross-border incursions to destroy these bases. The stakes were high, and the risks even higher. As the meeting concluded, a sense of urgency settled over the room. The men dispersed, their minds burdened by the weight of the decisions they had made. Outside, PROTEA buzzed with an air of normalcy, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Under the cover of darkness on July 31, 1982, columns of Casper armored vehicles rumbled toward the Namibian-Angolan border. Dust clouds rose in their wake, glowing faintly under the beams of muted headlights. Troops huddled inside, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and apprehension. Lieutenant Johann Venter, a fresh recruit from Bloemfontein, gripped his rifle tightly. The letters from home, neatly folded in his pocket, weighed heavier than the gear on his back. Across from him sat Sergeant Willem Pretorius, a seasoned soldier who had seen the horrors of war. "Keep your head down, kid," Pretorius said gruffly, his voice barely audible over the engine's roar. The border crossing was uneventful but tense. By dawn, the South African forces had penetrated deep into Angolan territory. The terrain was unforgiving, thick bush, uneven ground, and an oppressive heat that seemed to sap their strength with each step. The enemy was near, and every rustle of leaves carried the potential for danger. As they approached their first objective, the soldiers braced themselves. The tranquil beauty of the Angolan landscape belied the violence that was about to erupt. The first clash came swiftly and brutally. The SADF had targeted a FAPLA supply depot near the town of Kuvali. Reconnaissance reports indicated minimal resistance, but as the Caspers approached, a barrage of gunfire shattered the morning stillness. Chaos ensued. Lieutenant Venter ducked as bullets ricocheted off the vehicle's hull. Pretorius barked orders, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Return fire. Suppress their positions. Machine guns roared, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. The enemy forces, though smaller in number, fought with ferocity. Behind the lines, medics scrambled to tend to the wounded, their hands stained with blood as they worked tirelessly to save lives. By midday, the depot was secured. The SADF soldiers moved cautiously, wary of booby traps or lingering resistance. The scene was harrowing: burnt vehicles, scattered supplies, and the haunting silence that followed the battle. It was a grim reminder of the cost of war. The aftermath of the battle was a solemn affair. The supply depot lay in ruins, a testament to the ferocity of the clash. The soldiers moved methodically, clearing the area of any remaining threats. Among the rubble, they found hastily abandoned supplies, boxes of ammunition, crates of food, and maps that hinted at other enemy strongholds. Lieutenant Venter crouched beside one such crate, his hands trembling as he examined a faded map. "Look here," he called to Sergeant Pretorius, pointing at marked positions deep in Angolan territory. Pretorius squinted at the map and let out a low whistle. "This isn't just a depot. It's part of a much larger network. If we push forward, we can deal a serious blow to their operations," Pretorius said, his tone betraying a mix of excitement and caution. As the day wore on, the soldiers buried their fallen comrades in hastily dug graves. They stood in silence, caps held to their chests, as the chaplain muttered a brief prayer. The somber moment was interrupted by the sound of distant gunfire, a stark reminder that this was only the beginning. With the depot secured, the SADF pressed deeper into Angolan territory. The landscape grew denser, the jungle closing in around them. Visibility was limited, and every shadow seemed to conceal an enemy. The soldiers moved cautiously, their rifles at the ready. Private Samuel Makona, a quiet but observant man from Johannesburg, scanned the trees with practiced precision. "Something's not right," he muttered to his companion, Corporal Andre Leitgam. Moments later, the crack of a sniper rifle shattered the stillness. The column halted, soldiers diving for cover as bullets rained down from unseen positions. The enemy had anticipated their movements, setting up an ambush along the narrow trail. For what felt like hours, the jungle erupted in chaos, gunfire, shouting, and the sharp thuds of grenades. Finally, the ambush was broken. The enemy retreated, melting into the jungle as swiftly as they had appeared. The soldiers regrouped, shaken but resolute. They knew the dangers of pushing forward, but retreat was not an option. Their next target was Zangongo, a key logistics hub for SWAPO and FAPLA forces. Intelligence suggested it was heavily fortified, and the approach would be perilous. The SADF devised a multi-pronged strategy, combining ground assaults with aerial support. At dawn, the first artillery shells rained down on Zangongo, signaling the start of the assault. Mirage fighter jets screamed overhead, their payloads tearing through enemy defenses. On the ground, armored columns advanced with precision, their guns blazing. Inside the town, panic reigned. Civilians fled, seeking refuge from the relentless bombardment, while enemy soldiers scrambled to mount a defense. The streets became a battlefield, the once thriving town reduced to rubble in hours. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Venter and Sergeant Pretorius led their platoon through the shattered streets. Each corner turned could reveal danger, a sniper's nest, a hidden landmine, or a desperate last stand by enemy forces. By nightfall, Zangongo was under SADF control, but the victory came at a steep cost. Back in South Africa, news of the campaign trickled in, censored and sanitized for public consumption. Families waited anxiously for letters from the front, clinging to any word of their loved ones. Among them was Maria Venter, Johan's mother, who spent sleepless nights poring over his last letter. Meanwhile, in Angola, the realities of war weighed heavily on the soldiers. Private Makona found solace in conversations with Corporal Leitgam, their shared stories of home a brief escape from the grim surroundings. For Lieutenant Venter, the weight of command grew heavier with each passing day. "Do you ever wonder why we're really here?" Makona asked one evening as the platoon rested by a campfire. His question hung in the air, unanswered but understood. The war was as much about ideology as it was about survival, and each soldier grappled with its meaning in their own way. As the campaign continued, the bonds between the soldiers deepened. They were more than comrades, they were brothers, united by shared hardships and a singular purpose. The journey to Kivalai was arduous. The town was the next strategic target, a stronghold where enemy forces regrouped after the loss of Zangongo. For the SADF troops, the terrain was as much an adversary as the enemy itself. The Angolan bush seemed endless, its thick foliage concealing threats at every turn. Captain Hendrik van Zyl, commanding the convoy, emphasized caution during the pre-dawn briefing. "They'll know we're coming. Keep tight formations, stay vigilant, and remember, speed is our ally." As the convoy advanced, signs of enemy activity became evident. Burnt-out vehicles and abandoned camps dotted the landscape, relics of earlier skirmishes. The air was heavy with tension, every rustle in the undergrowth a potential ambush. When the first shots rang out, they came from the ridge overlooking the convoy. Enemy forces, lying in wait, unleashed a barrage of gunfire and RPGs. The battle was fierce, the SADF responding with mortar fire and air support. By dusk, the ridge was secured, but the cost was steep, more lives lost, more scars etched into the soldiers' psyches. Kyivali was no ordinary town. It was a fortress, bristling with defenses and teeming with SWAPO and FAPLA soldiers. The SAD's approach was deliberate, combining psychological warfare with coordinated assaults. In the dead of night, reconnaissance teams infiltrated the outskirts, planting explosives and gathering intelligence. Among them was Sergeant Willem Pretorius, whose quiet competence had earned him the respect of his peers. "This is the heart of their operations," he whispered to his team as they surveyed enemy movements. The assault began at dawn, the stillness shattered by the thunder of artillery. Tanks rolled forward, supported by infantry advancing through the debris-strewn streets. Enemy forces fought desperately, their resistance fueled by the knowledge that losing Kyivali would cripple their operations. The battle raged for days, each side suffering heavy casualties. When the SADF finally breached the last line of defense, the town lay in ruins. The soldiers, exhausted but victorious, reflected on the pyrrhic nature of their triumph. For every stronghold taken, the human cost seemed to grow heavier. Far from the front lines, the war's impact rippled through communities in South Africa and Angola alike. In Windhoek, Anna Malin, a schoolteacher, organized letters of support for troops stationed in Angola. Among her correspondence was Private Samuel Makona, whose thoughtful replies revealed the depth of his struggle to reconcile duty with the horrors of war. In Angola, the civilian population bore the brunt of the conflict. Lucia Mendes, a nurse in Kyivali, worked tirelessly to treat the wounded. Her clinic, once a place of hope, had become a makeshift hospital overwhelmed by casualties. Despite the danger, Lucia refused to abandon her post, her courage inspiring those around her. As the days turned into weeks, these lives, those of soldiers, civilians, and families, became interconnected threads in the tapestry of war. Letters from home, fleeting moments of humanity, and acts of defiance against despair provided glimpses of light amid the darkness. For Lieutenant Johann Venter, the weight of leadership grew heavier with each passing day. The young officer, once full of confidence, now bore the scars of countless battles. His nights were plagued by memories of fallen comrades and the faces of enemies he could not forget. One evening, as the platoon rested near a dried-up riverbed, Venter confided in Sergeant Pretorius. "Do you think we'll ever leave this place behind?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Pretorius, weathered by years of service, took a moment before responding. "The war stays with you, Johann. But so does the strength you find in moments like this, in your men, in their courage, in their belief in you." The conversation was interrupted by a crackle over the radio. Enemy movements had been detected nearby, and the soldiers sprang into action. There was no time to dwell on the past, the war demanded their full attention, leaving reflection for another day. The aftermath of Kyivali left a deep mark on both sides. For the SADF, the victory was a strategic triumph, but the cost in lives weighed heavily on the troops. Reinforcements arrived with fresh supplies and men, but the faces of the new soldiers betrayed their unease. They had heard the stories of ambushes, close-quarter combat, and the jungle that seemed alive with hostility. Captain Hendrik van Zyl gathered his officers to plan the next move. The target was an enemy encampment deep in the bush, rumored to house high-ranking SWAPO commanders. "This isn't just another raid," Van Zyl emphasized. "This is an opportunity to decapitate their leadership. It'll be tough, but it's necessary." The march to the encampment was grueling. The soldiers pushed through sweltering heat and unyielding terrain, their resolve tested with each step. Along the way, they encountered villages scarred by war, their inhabitants caught between survival and despair. By the time the SADF reached the outskirts of the camp, exhaustion was etched into their faces. But as they prepared for the assault, a quiet determination settled over them. They knew what was at stake, not just for the mission, but for the future of the conflict. Chapter 13, The Assault on the Encampment. In the pre-dawn hours, the SADF launched their attack. Artillery fire lit up the sky, followed by the roar of advancing tanks and the staccato bursts of automatic rifles. The enemy was well prepared, their defenses formidable. Machine gun nests and mortar positions unleashed a relentless barrage, forcing the soldiers to fight for every inch of ground. Private Samuel Makona found himself pinned behind a fallen tree, his heart pounding as bullets whizzed past. "Cover me," he shouted to Corporal Andre Laitgon before dashing toward an enemy position. The two worked in tandem, their movements precise, their bond forged in the crucible of combat. The battle raged on, the jungle transforming into a chaotic battlefield. Smoke filled the air, mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder. By mid-morning, the SADF had breached the camp's perimeter, engaging in fierce close-quarters combat. When the dust finally settled, the encampment lay in ruins. Among the prisoners captured were several key SWAPO commanders. It was a significant victory, but the toll it took on the soldiers was evident in their weary faces and the empty places where comrades once stood. As the SADF regrouped, the reality of their losses set in. Among the fallen was Sergeant Willem Pretorius, a stalwart figure whose guidance had been a beacon for many. His death cast a shadow over the platoon, leaving a void that could not be filled. Lieutenant Johann Venter, deeply affected by the loss, struggled to maintain his composure as he addressed the men. Sergeant Pretorius was more than a leader. He was a friend, a mentor, and an inspiration to us all. We owe it to him to carry on, to honor his sacrifice by completing this mission. The soldiers buried Pretorius in a clearing, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross. As they stood in silence, the jungle around them seemed to mourn alongside them, its stillness a stark contrast to the chaos of the battle. For Private Makona, Pretorius's death was a turning point. The war was no longer just about duty, it was personal. He resolved to fight not just for his country, but for the memory of those who had given everything. News of the SAT's successes in Operation MEBOS reached Pretoria, where military strategists debated their next steps. The campaign had dealt significant blows to SWAPO and FAPLA, but the war was far from over. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were regrouping further north, preparing for a counteroffensive. Back in Angola, the soldiers prepared for the next phase of the campaign. Supplies were restocked, equipment repaired, and reinforcements integrated into the ranks. The men bonded over shared stories and quiet moments, finding solace in camaraderie amid the chaos. Lieutenant Venter, now bearing the weight of leadership, worked tirelessly to inspire his troops. "We've faced impossible odds and come out stronger," he told them during a briefing. "Remember why we're here. Stay focused, stay united, and we'll see this through." As the SADF advanced into uncharted territory, they knew the challenges ahead would test them like never before. But they also knew they were part of something greater, a mission that would shape the course of history. The stretch of jungle north of Kivalai was eerily quiet. The soldiers of the SADF moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the dense foliage for signs of movement. For days, they had encountered no resistance, and the absence of conflict felt more unsettling than reassuring. Lieutenant Johann Venter stood atop an armored vehicle, binoculars pressed to his face. "They're out there," he muttered to Sergeant Viljoen, who had recently taken Pretorius's place. "They're watching us, waiting for the right moment." The men set up camp near a shallow river, their movements deliberate and silent. As night fell, the jungle came alive with the sounds of chirping insects and distant howls. Around the campfires, soldiers shared stories, their laughter a brief reprieve from the tension. But the calm was deceptive. In the shadows, SWAPO scouts observed their every move, relaying information back to their commanders. The stage was set for a confrontation, one that would test the limits of endurance and resolve. At dawn, the enemy struck. Mortar shells exploded in the center of the SADF camp, sending men scrambling for cover. The jungle erupted in chaos as SWAPO forces launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions. Private Samuel Makona dove into a trench, his rifle at the ready. Incoming from the east, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire and explosions. Corporal André Leitgon joined him, returning fire with practiced precision. Lieutenant Venter directed his troops with unwavering focus. "Hold the line. Push them back," he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Despite the overwhelming attack, the SADF soldiers held their ground, their training and discipline evident in their coordinated movements. After hours of intense fighting, the enemy began to retreat, their ranks broken by the resolute defense. The battlefield was littered with debris and the wounded, the aftermath a stark reminder of the cost of survival. As the smoke cleared, the SADF took stock of their losses. Among the injured was Corporal Leitgon, whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. Despite the pain, he insisted on staying with his unit. "I'm not leaving," he told the medics, his determination unwavering. The men worked tirelessly to fortify their position, knowing the enemy could strike again at any moment. Supplies were redistributed, and plans were made to evacuate the wounded. Lieutenant Venter, though weary, remained a pillar of strength for his men. That evening, the soldiers gathered to honor their fallen comrades. A simple ceremony was held, with prayers and quiet reflections shared around the campfires. For many, the weight of grief was tempered by a deep sense of duty. In the distance, the faint rumble of thunder echoed across the horizon. It was a reminder that the storm of war was far from over, and the challenges ahead would demand even greater sacrifices. With the ambush behind them, the SADF shifted their focus to the next phase of Operation MEBOS. Intelligence reports indicated that SWAPO and FAPLA forces were regrouping near a network of caves in the Central Highlands. The location was a critical hub for enemy logistics and command. The plan was bold, a combined assault involving airstrikes, artillery, and ground troops. Captain Hendrik van Zyl, now overseeing the operation, emphasized the importance of timing. Precision is key. If we move too soon, we risk failure. If we delay, they'll fortify further. The soldiers prepared meticulously, their movements honed by weeks of grueling combat. As they advanced toward the target, they encountered fierce resistance. The enemy fought with determination, using the terrain to their advantage. By nightfall, the caves were within reach. The SADF launched their final assault under the cover of darkness, their actions swift and decisive. The enemy stronghold fell, but the victory was tempered by the realization that the war was far from won. In the quiet moments after the battle, the soldiers of the SADF gathered to reflect on their journey. Private Makona, now a seasoned veteran, sat with Lieutenant Venter and the others around a dying fire. "I used to think war was about heroes," Makona said softly. "But it's not. It's about survival, about doing what needs to be done for the man next to you." Venter nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Heroes don't come back from this," he replied. "But if we make it home, it's because of each other." The night stretched on, the men finding solace in shared memories and quiet camaraderie. For all the pain and loss, there was an unspoken bond that united them, a resilience that carried them through the darkness. The story of Operation PROTEA. The year was 1981, a tense chapter in the history of Southern Africa. The South African border war was at its zenith, a conflict that pitted the South African Defense Forces, SADF, against the Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, among other forces. In this turbulent period, Operation PROTEA would unfold, a calculated and forceful military intervention that would leave an indelible mark on the region. The operation's objective was clear: to dismantle SWAPO's command and logistical centers in southern Angola, particularly in Zangongo and Onyiva. With its meticulous planning and extensive resources, this mission became one of the most significant cross-border incursions of the conflict. But beyond the strategies and weaponry, this was a story of human resilience, ambition, and the stark realities of war. In the shadows of Angola's sprawling savannas, tension simmered as the SADF prepared for a bold and unprecedented move. For years, SWAPO had used bases in Angola as launching points for their operations into Southwest Africa, now Namibia. The SADF, intent on disrupting these efforts, saw an opportunity to strike decisively. The decision to launch Operation PROTEA came after months of intelligence gathering. Reports indicated that SWAPO's central command operated out of Zangongo, a hub fortified with anti-aircraft guns, logistical supplies, and trained guerrilla fighters. Nearby, Onyiva served as a crucial supply depot, stocked with ammunition, fuel, and provisions. Major General Charles Lloyd, commanding the operation, was a man known for his strategic acumen. Under his leadership, the SADF meticulously mapped the mission. Ground forces, armored convoys, and air support were coordinated in a synchronized plan to maximize efficiency and minimize casualties. As August approached, the troops were primed for action, their resolve steeled by the knowledge that success could shift the balance of the war. At the break of dawn on August 23, 1981, the silence of Angola's wilderness was shattered by the roar of jet engines. Mirage and Buccaneer aircraft swooped low over the terrain, their payloads targeting SWAPO's defenses in Zangongo. The aerial assault was precise, designed to neutralize anti-aircraft batteries and create a safe passage for the advancing ground forces. Meanwhile, columns of SADF vehicles, bristling with troops and weaponry, crossed the border under cover of darkness. The 61 Mechanized Battalion Group led the charge, its tanks carving paths through the rugged landscape. For soldiers like Corporal Johan van Zyl, the journey was a mix of adrenaline and trepidation. Each mile brought them closer to the enemy, the weight of their mission growing heavier with every step. As the ground forces converged on Zangongo, they encountered pockets of resistance. SWAPO fighters, though outgunned, were fiercely determined to defend their stronghold. The SAD's superior firepower gradually overwhelmed these defenses, paving the way for a critical assault on the command center. By midday, the battle for Zangongo was in full swing. The town, a once thriving settlement, had become a battlefield marked by explosions and gunfire. SWAPO's headquarters, a nondescript building fortified with sandbags and makeshift barricades, became the focal point of the conflict. Captain Saifo Dlamini, an intelligence officer with the SADF, watched the unfolding chaos from a command vehicle. His role was to coordinate air support and relay intelligence to the ground troops. Despite the clamor of war around him, Dlamini maintained his composure, his voice steady as he directed operations. After hours of relentless fighting, the SADF breached SWAPO's defenses. Soldiers stormed the headquarters, securing documents, weapons, and communication equipment. For many on both sides, the moment was bittersweet, a tactical victory marred by the loss of comrades and the realization that the war was far from over. Having secured Zangongo, the SADF turned its attention to Ongiva. The town, though less fortified, presented its own challenges. SWAPO's forces, aware of the approaching threat, had prepared a determined defense. Trenches were dug, machine gun nests were established, and snipers took positions in the surrounding hills. The approach to Ongiva was marked by ambushes and skirmishes. For Private Maria Kutsi, a medic with the SADF, these encounters were a stark reminder of war's brutality. Her days were spent tending to the wounded, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. In moments of quiet, she wrote letters to her family, her words a mix of hope and sorrow. As the SADF closed in on Ongiva, the intensity of the fighting escalated. Artillery barrages softened the defenses, but the final assault required close-quarters combat. By the evening of September 2nd, Ongiva was under SADF control. The operation's objectives had been achieved, but the human cost was undeniable. Operation PROTEA marked a turning point in the South African border war. The destruction of SWAPO's bases disrupted their operations, but it also intensified international scrutiny of South Africa's policies and military actions. For the soldiers who participated, the memories of those days remained etched in their minds. General Lloyd, in his post-operation report, praised the bravery and discipline of his troops. Yet, he acknowledged the broader implications of the conflict. "We have won this battle," he wrote, "but the war continues, and with it, the struggles of our nation." For Maria Kutsi, the letters she sent home became a lifeline, a way to process her experiences. In one, she described a moment of quiet after the battle. The sun set over the savannah, painting the sky in hues of red and gold. "For a brief moment, there was peace, and I remembered why we endure." As the dust settled over Zangongo and Ongiva, the reality of war began to sink in for both the victors and the defeated. Soldiers on both sides bore physical scars, but the emotional wounds ran deeper. Villages surrounding the battle zones, home to countless civilians, had been caught in the crossfire, their lives forever changed by the destruction. For Sergeant Paul Makona, the aftermath was a stark reminder of war's indiscriminate nature. While leading a patrol through a nearby settlement, he encountered displaced families searching for loved ones amid the ruins. Makona's men shared their rations with the villagers, a small gesture of humanity amid the chaos. Meanwhile, SWAPO fighters who had survived the battles regrouped in the dense Angolan wilderness. Among them was Elias Ndundama, a young recruit who had witnessed his comrades fall at Zangongo. Determined to continue the fight, Elias found strength in the solidarity of his unit and their shared cause. The war, he realized, was not just about territories but about the future of his homeland. The international response to Operation PROTEA was swift and polarizing. The South African government framed the operation as a necessary defense against SWAPO incursions, emphasizing its military success. However, condemnation came from across the globe, with many nations criticizing South Africa's actions as aggressive violations of Angola's sovereignty. At the United Nations, representatives from Angola and allied nations raised alarms about the humanitarian impact of the operation. Photos of devastated villages and displaced families were displayed, fueling debates about South Africa's role in the region. For diplomats like Maria de Andrade, representing Angola, the mission was personal. Her own family had been uprooted during the conflict, and she vowed to ensure their voices were heard on the global stage. Despite the criticism, the South African government remained resolute, citing the operation's disruption of SWAPO's capabilities as a key victory. The SADC's leadership prepared for potential backlash, knowing that their actions had drawn the world's attention to the border war in a way no previous operation had. By the end of 1981, the landscape of the South African border war had shifted. SWAPO, while weakened, adapted their strategies, using the international outcry to bolster support for their cause. Recruitment efforts increased, drawing fighters from across southern Africa who saw the struggle as part of a larger fight against apartheid. For the SADF, the victory at Zangongo and Ongiva brought strategic gains but also new challenges. Intelligence reports indicated that SWAPO had established new bases deeper in Angola, far beyond the reach of conventional ground operations. Discussions among South African military leaders began to shift toward the possibility of more sophisticated, long-term campaigns. Among the soldiers, the war's toll became evident in the rising cases of psychological strain. Johan van Zyl, once a confident corporal, found himself haunted by the faces of fallen comrades and the destruction he had witnessed. Seeking solace, he turned to a chaplain who reminded him of the importance of hope even amid darkness. As the border war continued, the stories of those who lived it began to emerge. For Maria Kutsi, her role as a medic became a source of purpose. She began documenting her experiences in a journal, capturing the moments of humanity that persisted despite the horrors of war. One entry described a chance meeting with an Angolan nurse named Anna, who worked in a field clinic near Ongiva. Despite being on opposing sides, the two shared a quiet moment of understanding, exchanging stories about their families and dreams for peace. For Maria, this meeting reinforced the notion that war, though brutal, could not extinguish the shared humanity that united them. In contrast, Elias Ndundama's resolve hardened. Each skirmish with the SADF strengthened his commitment to SWAPO's cause. He became a leader among his peers, inspiring younger fighters with his unwavering belief in their eventual victory. Yet, in his private moments, he mourned the loss of friends, wondering if their sacrifices would ever lead to freedom. SWAPO's response to Operation PROTEA came swiftly and with tactical ingenuity. Displaced but not defeated, they adopted new guerrilla strategies to counter the SADC's overwhelming firepower. Their fighters began targeting supply convoys and isolated outposts in Southwest Africa, leveraging the terrain and their intimate knowledge of the region. Elias Ndundama became a key figure in these efforts, leading a small unit of fighters through dense bushland to ambush South African patrols. Armed with Soviet-supplied weapons, Elias and his comrades became a constant thorn in the side of the SADF. Their mobility and unpredictability forced the South Africans to expend resources on defense, stretching their capabilities thin. Meanwhile, the SADF countered with intensified intelligence efforts. Reconnaissance aircraft scanned the vast Angolan wilderness, while covert units infiltrated SWAPO's ranks. For Captain Sifo Dlamini, now leading intelligence operations, the cat-and-mouse game was a grueling test of patience and strategy. Success depended not only on firepower but on outsmarting an enemy who seemed to vanish into the landscape. As 1982 dawned, the psychological strain on soldiers became increasingly evident. In the SADC's ranks, the harsh conditions of war and the constant threat of ambush took their toll. Camps became places of camaraderie but also of quiet reflection, where soldiers grappled with the realities of their mission. Private Maria Kutsi continued her work as a medic, her journal filling with stories of the wounded and the lives she tried to save. One entry described a young recruit, barely 18, whose injuries left him physically and emotionally scarred. Maria's letters home grew more somber, her once hopeful tone now tinged with doubt. For SWAPO fighters, the toll was no less severe. Elias Ndundama's unit faced dwindling supplies and the constant threat of discovery. The harsh Angolan wilderness offered no respite, and illness spread through the ranks. Yet, their resolve remained unshaken, driven by a belief in the justice of their cause and the hope of a liberated homeland. Back in South Africa, the conflict's impact rippled through society. While the government portrayed the war as a necessary defense against communism and terrorism, dissenting voices began to grow louder. Families of soldiers killed in action questioned the cost of the war, while activists within the country drew connections between the border war and apartheid's broader system of oppression. Among these voices was Reverend Peter Malangu, a clergyman who had lost his nephew during Operation PROTEA. In his sermons, he called for peace and an end to violence on all sides. His words resonated with a growing number of South Africans, many of whom were weary of the constant state of conflict. For soldiers like Johan van Zyl, returning home on leave offered little solace. The disconnect between the battlefield and civilian life was jarring, and he found himself grappling with guilt over the lives lost and the destruction he had witnessed. Johan's visits to the church became a lifeline, a place where he sought answers to questions that seemed unanswerable. The global community's scrutiny of South Africa's actions intensified in the wake of Operation PROTEA. Nations that had remained silent on the border war began to voice their concerns, and economic sanctions against South Africa gained traction. At the United Nations, resolutions condemning the incursions into Angola garnered widespread support. Diplomat Maria de Andrade, representing Angola, spearheaded efforts to rally international aid for displaced civilians. Her passionate speeches highlighted the human cost of the conflict, drawing attention to the plight of those caught in the crossfire. Her advocacy led to increased humanitarian support, but she knew that true peace required more than temporary relief. Within South Africa's military leadership, the shifting international landscape prompted a re-evaluation of strategy. General Charles Lloyd recognized the growing isolation of his country and the long-term challenges of sustaining the war effort. His reports to PROTEA carried a cautious tone, warning that military victories would be hollow without addressing the political and social undercurrents fueling the conflict. The story of Operation Reindeer. In May 1978, the sun rose over the vast, arid landscapes of southern Angola, casting a haunting glow over the impending conflict. Beneath the golden horizon, soldiers prepared for battle, their hearts weighed down by the gravity of what lay ahead. This was not a mere skirmish, it was Operation Reindeer, a pivotal chapter in the South African border war, one that would ripple across history with consequences far beyond its temporal bounds. The story begins here, in the shadows of a geopolitical chessboard, where ideologies clashed and lives hung in the balance. It is a tale of strategy, sacrifice, and survival, told through the interwoven experiences of individuals whose lives were forever changed by the events of those fateful days. The roots of Operation Reindeer stretched deep into the fabric of the Cold War, where superpowers vied for influence in Africa. The South African Defense Force, SADF, had identified bases of the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, across the border in Angola as threats to Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia. In Pretoria, high-ranking officials convened in dimly lit rooms, poring over intelligence reports. Among them was Constant Viljoen, a meticulous strategist and SADF commander, whose resolve was as steely as the weapons they prepared to deploy. "We must act decisively," he declared, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The target, a settlement called Kasinga, believed to be a SWAPO stronghold. Across the border, Kasinga buzzed with activity. It was a sanctuary for SWAPO fighters and their families, a hub for planning operations against South African forces. Yet, for many, it was also home, a place where laughter echoed through dusty courtyards and children played under the watchful eyes of their elders. The impending storm was still a distant whisper on the wind. On the morning of May 4, 1978, the air above Angola stirred with the faint hum of aircraft engines. South African paratroopers prepared for deployment, their faces set in grim determination. Among them was Lieutenant Johan Botha, a young officer whose thoughts flickered between duty and the loved ones he had left behind. As the aircraft soared over the arid expanse, the men inside clutched their gear, their knuckles white with tension. "Remember the mission," Johan's commanding officer barked. "We hit them hard and fast. No room for mistakes." Below, Kasinga remained oblivious to the approaching storm. The settlement bustled with morning routines, women tending to chores, children chasing one another, and fighters sharpening their resolve. The tranquility would soon shatter, replaced by chaos and destruction. As the planes approached their drop zones, the soldiers inside braced for the plunge. The whisper of wings grew louder, a harbinger of the battle to come. The paratroopers descended swiftly, their parachutes unfurling like ghostly flowers against the bright sky. On the ground, panic erupted as the first shots rang out. SWAPO fighters scrambled to defend their home, but the assault was relentless. Johan landed amidst the chaos, his senses overwhelmed by the cacophony of war. Explosions rattled the air as South African artillery rained down on the settlement. Smoke billowed, obscuring the sun and casting an eerie pall over the battlefield. Inside Kasinga, civilians sought shelter wherever they could. Maria Nanda, a schoolteacher, huddled with a group of children in a makeshift bunker. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her heart ached for the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. The battle raged for hours, each moment etched with blood and fire. When the dust began to settle, the once vibrant settlement lay in ruins, a stark testament to the brutal cost of war. As the sun set over the battlefield, the extent of the devastation became clear. Kasinga was no longer a haven but a graveyard, its streets littered with debris and the bodies of those who had perished. The survivors emerged cautiously, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. Maria, clutching a wounded child, stumbled through the wreckage in search of help. Her resolve to protect the innocent burned brighter than ever, even amidst the ashes of her shattered world. Meanwhile, Johan and his comrades regrouped, their mission deemed a success but their spirits heavy with the weight of what they had done. Far away, news of the raid spread like wildfire, igniting debates in international corridors of power. Accusations of war crimes and justifications of self-defense clashed in a storm of rhetoric, each side entrenched in its perspective. For those who lived through it, however, the rhetoric was irrelevant. Operation Reindeer had left scars that would never fully heal, scars that told a story of courage and cruelty, resilience and ruin. In Pretoria, the headquarters of the South African Defence Force, SADF, hummed with controlled chaos. Maps of southern Angola sprawled across tables, marked with colored pins and arrows. Constance Viljoen, a stoic figure, reviewed the operation's aftermath with his closest advisors. "The mission was a tactical success," he began, his voice measured. "But the fallout is far from over." Intelligence reports suggested a surge of anger and calls for retaliation from SWAPO. For Viljoen, the operation was only the beginning of a prolonged campaign. "We've shaken the hornet's nest," he added grimly. As they strategized for the coming days, Viljoen's mind turned to the men in the field. Soldiers like Johann Botha were now part of the chessboard's living pieces, moving in the shadow of decisions made far from the front lines. Their survival depended on precision and discipline, but war rarely adhered to plans. In Kasinga, the human toll of these strategies became clearer. Maria Nanda worked tirelessly with what few resources remained, tending to survivors' wounds. Every face she encountered told a story of loss and resilience, and she vowed to be their voice in a world that seemed indifferent. The anger within SWAPO's ranks was palpable. Survivors from Kasinga regrouped, sharing stories of the devastation. Among them was Jonas Amutinia, a seasoned fighter whose sister had perished in the raid. His grief was raw, fueling his resolve to strike back. "We cannot let this go unanswered," Jonas declared to his comrades. Their commanders agreed, initiating plans for counteroffensives to demonstrate SWAPO's resolve. Messages were sent to sympathetic allies, requesting aid and resources. Across the Angolan landscape, tensions mounted as both sides prepared for the next move. Meanwhile, Johann Botha and his unit were stationed at a makeshift base, preparing for further engagements. The young officer couldn't shake the memories of Kasinga, of smoke, screams, and the haunting sight of Maria carrying a child through the chaos. Did we make a difference, or just create more enemies? He wondered aloud, drawing uneasy glances from his comrades. War's uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone, from the strategists in PROTEA to the fighters in the bush. The winds of retaliation were blowing, and no one could predict where they would lead. Far from the battlefield, Operation Reindeer became a flashpoint on the international stage. The United Nations convened an emergency session to address the raid, with diplomats from opposing blocs clashing over its implications. South Africa's representatives framed the operation as a preemptive strike against terrorism, while others decried it as a massacre. One of the most vocal critics was the Angolan ambassador, who stood before the assembly with photos of Kasinga's aftermath. "This is not defense, it is devastation," he declared. The room buzzed with debate, each speech underscoring the complexities of Cold War-era geopolitics. In Washington and Moscow, intelligence analysts monitored the situation closely. Both superpowers saw opportunities to sway alliances, but for ordinary Angolans, the diplomatic theater felt detached from their suffering. Maria, unaware of the global discussions, continued her quiet rebellion against despair. She rallied survivors to rebuild Kasinga, not as a military base, but as a symbol of endurance. Her actions inspired those around her, even as the specter of more violence loomed. The following weeks brought an uneasy quiet to southern Angola. Both SWAPO and the SADF used the lull to regroup and gather intelligence. For Johann Botha's unit, this meant long patrols through harsh terrain, punctuated by moments of camaraderie and reflection. Johann found solace in writing letters home, though he often hesitated to describe the true horrors of what he'd seen. His mother's responses were filled with concern and prayers for his safety, grounding him in a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. In the SWAPO camps, Jonas Amutinia trained recruits with a fervor born of personal loss. His resolve inspired those around him, but it also blinded him to the toll the war was taking on their morale. "We must be ready for anything," he insisted, even as whispers of doubt crept into his comrades' conversations. The stage was set for another clash, and everyone involved knew it was only a matter of time. The calm before the storm was fragile, and the first spark could ignite a fire that would consume them all. The air was thick with anticipation as both sides prepared for their next moves. For the SADF, the success of Operation Reindeer was a morale boost, but they knew the enemy was regrouping. Reports of SWAPO fighters rallying at nearby camps prompted the planning of new offensives. Constant Vigilant oversaw the preparations with the precision of a chess master. "We strike fast and eliminate the threat before it grows," he instructed his commanders. His strategy hinged on speed, surprise, and the element of overwhelming force. In the early hours of June, codenamed Operation Thunderclouds, a follow-up assault was set into motion. Meanwhile, Jonas Amutinha and his comrades prepared defenses at their new base near Chittekra. They dug trenches and set up ambush points, knowing the SAV's tactics well. "This time, we're ready," Jonas assured his unit, though deep down, he questioned whether they could withstand the might of their adversaries. As night fell, the stage was set for another deadly encounter. Both sides braced themselves for the thunderclouds of war to break. At dawn, the silence of the Angolan bush was shattered by the roar of jets overhead. South African aircraft struck first, dropping ordnance on SWAPO positions and scattering their defenses. The bombardment was relentless, paving the way for ground troops to advance. Johan Bota's unit was among the first to enter the fray. The young officer felt his pulse quicken as the sound of gunfire echoed around him. "Stay close and move fast," he shouted to his men. The terrain was unforgiving, and every step felt precarious as they navigated through smoke and debris. Jonas Amutinha fought with ferocity, rallying his comrades to hold their ground. "We've survived worse," he roared, leading a counterattack that momentarily stalled the SAV's advance. Yet, the enemy's superior firepower and coordination began to overwhelm SWAPO's defenses. By midday, the base at Chittekra was in ruins. Jonas, wounded but alive, retreated with the survivors into the dense Angolan wilderness. For the SADF, it was another victory, but the cost in lives weighed heavily on Johan and his comrades. The battlefield was strewn with the fallen, a grim reminder of the human cost of war. News of the battle spread quickly. In Pretoria, the government celebrated the operation as another triumph against insurgency. State-run media lauded the bravery of the SADF soldiers and painted the operation as a decisive blow to SWAPO's capabilities. However, among the troops, the mood was somber. Johan sat with his unit that evening, staring into the flickering flames of a campfire. The faces around him were tired, haunted by the day's events. "They'll call this a victory," one soldier muttered, "but it feels like anything but." Back in Chittekra, Jonas and the surviving SWAPO fighters regrouped. The loss was devastating, but their spirits were unbroken. "They can destroy our camps," Jonas declared, "but they can't destroy our cause." His words galvanized the group, though the path forward seemed increasingly perilous. Maria Nanda, far from the battle, continued her quiet work in Kasinga. She listened to the stories of new arrivals fleeing the violence, their accounts painting a picture of despair. Yet, she refused to let the darkness consume her. "We will endure," she told them, her resolve as strong as ever. The weeks following the battle were marked by increased violence along the border. Both sides escalated their efforts, each determined to outlast the other. For the civilians caught in the crossfire, the war became an inescapable nightmare. Maria found herself tending to more refugees, their stories blending into a tragic tapestry of loss. Among them was a young boy, Paulo, who had lost his entire family in the bombing of Chittekra. "I don't want to fight," he whispered to Maria one night, his eyes brimming with tears. "I just want to go home." For Jonas Amutinha, the war became deeply personal. Each loss fueled his determination to strike back, though he began to notice fractures within SWAPO's ranks. Supplies were dwindling, morale was low, and whispers of desertion crept through the camps. Meanwhile, Johan Botha faced his own struggles. Letters from home spoke of pride in his service, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were contributing to a cycle of suffering. Is this what victory feels like? He asked himself, staring at the night sky, the weight of his role pressing down on him. The war's price was being paid in blood and tears, and there seemed no end in sight. As weeks turned into months, the memories of Chittekra lingered in the minds of both the victors and the survivors. The SADF had gained ground, but their troops were weary, their spirits burdened by the cost of each engagement. Johann Botha found himself replaying the sounds of the battlefield in his mind, gunfire, cries for help, and the deafening silence that followed. Johann wrote another letter to his family. This time, he was honest about his doubts. "We call them enemies, but they bleed and grieve like us," he confessed. He kept the letter in his pocket, unsure if it would ever find its way to his mother's hands. In SWAPO's makeshift camps, Jonas Amutinia stood before a group of new recruits. Their faces were young, some barely teenagers. "You're not just soldiers," he told them. "You're fighting for the future of our people." Yet, in the quiet moments, Jonas wrestled with his own despair. How many more battles could they endure before the dream of freedom became an impossible burden? For Maria Nanda, the fallout of war meant an endless tide of wounded and orphaned. She had no weapons or strategies, only the strength of her compassion. "If we cannot fight, we must heal," she told Paulo, the boy who now shadowed her every step. Her small acts of kindness became a beacon of hope for those around her. In the Angolan countryside, whispers of retaliation grew louder. SWAPO leaders convened in secret, planning a bold counterstrike to reclaim their position. Jonas Amutinia was among the voices urging caution. "We must be strategic," he argued. "A reckless attack will only strengthen their resolve." But the tide of anger among the rank and file was hard to quell. For many, the desire for vengeance outweighed concerns about the consequences. They saw the SADF as an unrelenting force that had to be challenged head-on. Across the border, the SADF intercepted fragments of intelligence pointing to a potential offensive. Constant Biljoen ordered increased patrols and defensive measures. "We will not be caught off guard," he warned. Yet, the mounting tension began to strain the troops. Johann's unit was stretched thin, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of attack. The days felt longer as both sides prepared for the next inevitable clash. The rumors hung in the air like storm clouds, darkening the spirits of all who heard them. On a moonless night, the rumors became reality. SWAPO launched a surprise raid on an SADF outpost near the border, aiming to disrupt their operations and sow chaos. Jonas Amutinia led a small team, moving silently through the underbrush. Every step was a test of nerve as they approached the enemy's perimeter. The attack began with a coordinated explosion, shattering the stillness of the night. Jonas and his men stormed the camp, their movements swift and deliberate. The SADF soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled to defend their position. Johann Botha was jolted awake by the sound of gunfire. Grabbing his rifle, he joined his comrades in the chaos. The night became a blur of muzzle flashes and shouted commands. "Hold the line," his commander barked, but the SWAPO fighters were relentless. When dawn broke, the outpost was barely standing. The attackers had withdrawn, leaving destruction in their wake. Johann surveyed the aftermath with a sinking heart. Among the wreckage, he found a discarded SWAPO scarf, its bright color stark against the gray ash. It was a symbol of defiance that haunted him. The raid, though costly for SWAPO, was a psychological blow to the SADF. It reminded the troops that the enemy was capable of striking deep into their territory. Constant Viljoen ordered an investigation into the breach, determined to prevent another attack. "This cannot happen again," he said firmly. For Jonas, the raid was a bittersweet victory. They had proven their resilience, but the losses were heavy. He consoled himself with the thought that every action brought them closer to their goal, even if the cost was high. "We cannot give up now," he told his weary comrades. Maria Nanda received news of the raid from fleeing civilians. The stories were filled with equal parts fear and admiration for Swapo's audacity. She continued her work, patching wounds and offering words of comfort. Her small sanctuary in Kasinga became a haven for those seeking solace amidst the chaos. Johan, reflecting on the raid, felt the weight of his role pressing harder. He wondered if his actions were making any real difference. "Is this what it means to serve?" he wrote in his journal, his words heavy with doubt. The war was teaching everyone lessons, though not all of them were easy to bear. In the wake of the night raid, intelligence became the lifeline of both the SADF and SWAPO. South African operatives intensified their surveillance, using aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications to piece together SWAPO's movements. Every scrap of information was analyzed, every signal a potential clue. Johan Bota's unit was assigned to patrol a region suspected of harboring SWAPO fighters. The days were grueling, filled with tension and long stretches of silence. Eyes open, Johan reminded his men, scanning the horizon for signs of an ambush. Every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. On the other side, Jonas Amutinia and his comrades relied on secrecy and the trust of local villagers. They communicated through couriers and hidden signals, knowing that any misstep could expose them. Jonas often met with his team in the dead of night, their discussions whispered under the cover of darkness. The two sides played a deadly game of cat and mouse, each step forward fraught with uncertainty. The war was not just fought with bullets but with wits, as both armies sought to outmaneuver one another in a landscape that gave nothing away. One evening, Johan's unit was tasked with intercepting a SWAPO convoy reported to be transporting weapons. The mission was urgent, and the intelligence seemed solid. They moved swiftly under cover of darkness, setting up an ambush along the convoy's suspected route. Hours passed in tense anticipation. The soldiers whispered to one another, their rifles trained on the dirt road. Finally, the sound of distant engines broke the silence. Johan signaled his men to hold steady. The convoy's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a line of trucks. "Wait for my signal," Johan murmured, his finger resting on the trigger. As the first truck passed, he gave the order. Gunfire erupted, shattering the night. The ambush was precise, and within minutes, the trucks were immobilized. When the soldiers inspected the convoy, they found weapons and supplies, but also something unexpected, a group of civilians hidden among the cargo. "They're just refugees," Johan muttered, his stomach sinking. The incident blurred the lines between enemy and innocent, leaving the soldiers grappling with the moral complexities of their mission. The discovery of civilians in the convoy left a lasting impact on Johan and his comrades. The incident was reported up the chain of command, but the official narrative framed it as another tactical success. For Johan, the truth was far more complicated. "What are we really fighting for?" he asked one evening, his voice heavy with frustration. His comrades offered no answers, their silence a reflection of their own doubts. The war had become a labyrinth of moral ambiguity, where every choice carried consequences. For Jonas Amutinia, the convoy's loss was a bitter blow. The weapons were meant to arm new recruits, and their absence left the fighters vulnerable. "We'll adapt," he assured his men, though the strain was evident in his voice. Each setback tested their resolve, forcing them to dig deeper into reserves of strength they didn't know they had. Maria Nanda, far from the battlefield, heard about the ambush from a wounded villager. The story angered her, not just for the lives lost but for the growing sense that the war cared little for its victims. "We must hold on to our humanity," she told her small group of survivors, even as the world around them seemed to lose its way. As tensions escalated, Kasinga became a focal point once again. Maria's efforts to rebuild the settlement had attracted the attention of SWAPO fighters seeking refuge and SADF operatives tracking their movements. The fragile peace of the community was under constant threat. One afternoon, a scout arrived with urgent news: a South African patrol was approaching. Maria gathered the villagers, urging them to hide. "Stay quiet and stay together," she instructed, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. The patrol passed through without incident, but the close call left the villagers shaken. Among them was Paulo, the young boy who had become Maria's shadow. "Why do they want to hurt us?" he asked, his eyes wide with confusion. Maria knelt beside him, searching for the right words. "Because they are afraid," she said gently. "But fear doesn't have to make us like them." For the SADF, the patrol was uneventful, another routine sweep in a war that seemed endless. Johann, watching the horizon, felt a strange unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the war was pulling him further from the person he once was. In the shadows of Kasinga, lives intersected in ways they could not yet understand, the threads of their stories tightening with each passing day.